There is a kind of power that announces itself, eager to be recognized, and another that never has to. The first spends itself when it is used. The second grows quieter with time until people simply begin to arrange themselves around it. This book is about that second kind of power, the invisible mechanics that create it. Most people who study influence look for tactics, the right words, posture, or clever move. Tactics have their place, but without understanding the principles beneath them, they are fragile. What separates occasional persuasion from effortless command is not a larger collection of tricks, but a deeper understanding of how people actually respond to one another. These principles are not new. Strategists, diplomats, generals, and careful observers of human behavior have recognized them for centuries. This book does not claim to have invented them. It simply names them, organizes them, and makes them usable, not as manipulation, but as literacy, an understanding of a language most people speak without knowing its grammar. Influence can be uncomfortable to examine. It involves timing, restraint, what is revealed and what is withheld, and the ability to read people accurately. Some prefer to believe that merit, honesty, and hard work alone determine outcomes. There is truth in that. But good intentions are not always enough in rooms where others understand these forces and use them deliberately. It is better to understand the game than to unknowingly become a piece on someone else's board. The 33 codes that follow explore different dimensions of influence, perception, timing, restraint, leverage, alliance, and adaptation. Together, they form less a checklist than a way of seeing. Mastery is not applying every principle at once, but knowing which one a moment demands, and having the discipline to use it without announcing that you are doing so. This book asks you to observe yourself, others, and the subtle exchanges of power present in almost every interaction. Read slowly. Test each idea against your own experience. Real influence is not learned from a page alone. It is built through study, practice, and the patient accumulation of moments when you chose a deliberate response instead of a reflexive one. What follows is not a promise of power for its own sake. It is an invitation to understand what lies beneath it, so that whatever you choose to build with that understanding, you build with your eyes fully open. Part 1. Seeing Clearly. Chapter 1. The Code of Observation. Most people move through a room already talking, rehearsing what they will say next, waiting for their turn to speak, half listening while composing their own response. This is the ordinary state of human attention, and it is precisely why observation, done properly, is such a rare and quietly formidable skill. The person who has trained themselves to watch before they speak sees an entirely different room than everyone else in it. They notice who deferred to whom before either of them said a word. They notice the slight delay before an answer, the tension in a jaw that a smile was meant to conceal, the subject someone roots around rather than approaches directly. None of this requires special insight into human psychology. It requires only the discipline of looking before reacting, which turns out to be far harder than it sounds. Because most people find silence, even brief silence, uncomfortable enough to fill immediately. Observation begins with a simple shift, treating every interaction as a source of information rather than merely an exchange to get through. When you enter a meeting already forming your talking points, You are gathering nothing. You are simply waiting for your cue. When you enter the same meeting, watching seating arrangements, watching who speaks first and who speaks last, watching whose comments others build on and whose comments are quietly let go, you begin accumulating a map of the actual power dynamics in the room, which are almost never identical to the official org chart or stated agenda. Titles tell you who is supposed to have influence. Observation tells you who actually does. This skill sharpens considerably once you learn to watch for what does not happen, not only what does. The question left unasked in a meeting where everyone clearly had one. The person who was not invited, though the topic concerned them directly. The praise that was withheld exactly where you'd expect it to be offered freely. Absence, in social dynamics, is rarely accidental, and it often carries more information than what is said aloud, precisely because it is unguarded. People are far more careful about their words than about their omissions. There is also a second layer to observation, subtler than watching others. Watching yourself being watched. The skilled observer understands that they too are constantly being read, and this awareness changes what they choose to reveal. A face that shows every flicker of frustration or excitement hands valuable information to anyone paying attention. And in most rooms, someone always is. This does not mean becoming cold or unreadable in every circumstance. That itself becomes a signal, and an off-putting one. It means becoming deliberate about what you allow to surface. Understanding that your own expressions are data other people are quietly collecting, whether or not you intend them to. The discipline required here is considerable, because human beings are wired for immediate reaction. Something is said that stings, and the instinct is to respond instantly, to defend, to correct, to fill the space. The observer trains themselves to introduce a pause between stimulus and response. Not a long, awkward silence, but a beat long enough to actually register what just happened, rather than simply reacting to it. In that small pause lives an enormous amount of leverage, because it is precisely the moment where most people, moving on instinct, reveal the most about themselves, and where the observer, moving on discipline, gathers the most. Over time, this practice compounds. Each observed interaction adds to a growing, largely unconscious model of how a particular person operates, what motivates them, what unsettles them, what they protect, and what they're willing to sacrifice. This model becomes the foundation for everything else in this book. You cannot apply timing, leverage, positioning, or any of the codes that follow with any real precision if you have not first done the quieter, less glamorous work of simply paying close attention. Influence built without observation is guesswork dressed up as strategy. Influence built on real observation is something else entirely. It is accurate, and accuracy, applied patiently, is very difficult to outmaneuver. Chapter 2. The Code of Silence. There is a particular kind of discomfort that arrives in the space right after someone finishes speaking before anyone has responded. Most people cannot tolerate this discomfort for more than a second or two, and so they rush to fill it. With agreement, with elaboration, with a story of their own that shifts the subject back toward themselves. This reflex, so common it barely registers as a choice, is one of the most consistent ways that people give away more than they intend to. Silence, held deliberately, is not passive. It is one of the most active instruments available in any exchange, and almost no one is trained to use it well. Consider what actually happens in a negotiation, a difficult conversation, or even an ordinary meeting when one person says less than they know. The gap left by their restraint does not stay empty. Someone else fills it, usually with more information than they intended to share. Because unfilled silence creates a kind of social pressure that most people resolve by talking. Ask a pointed question and then simply wait, resisting the urge to soften it, rephrase it, or offer an easier alternative. And you will often find the other person volunteering far more than a second more aggressive question would have extracted. Silence does the interrogating that words cannot, precisely because it applies no visible pressure at all. This code is frequently misunderstood as secrecy for its own sake, as though the goal were to become opaque, withholding, impossible to read. That is not what is being described here. Say less than you know is not an instruction to deceive. It is an instruction to resist the compulsion toward total disclosure, which is a very different thing. Most people over-explain out of anxiety, a fear of being misunderstood, a need to justify a position before it's even been challenged, a discomfort with letting a statement stand on its own without immediate reinforcement. This over-explaining rarely persuades anyone. More often, it hands the listener additional surface area to question, doubt, or exploit. A position stated once, clearly, and then left alone, carries more weight than the same position defended 3 additional times out of nervousness. There is also a strategic dimension worth understanding plainly. Every piece of information you share is a piece of information someone else can use, sometimes against you, sometimes simply to predict and therefore neutralize your next move. This is true even among allies, not only adversaries, because intentions shift, circumstances change, and information given freely today can resurface in contexts you never anticipated. This does not mean treating every relationship with suspicion. It means developing the habit of asking before you speak whether this particular disclosure actually serves the outcome you want, or whether it simply serves the temporary relief of feeling fully understood in the moment. Those are not always the same thing, and confusing them is one of the most common ways influence quietly leaks away. Practicing this code requires distinguishing between withholding out of fear and withholding out of discipline. Fear-based silence is defensive, brittle, and often obvious to others. A refusal to engage that reads as evasiveness or mistrust. Disciplined silence is calm, deliberate, and usually goes unnoticed as a technique at all. It simply looks like composure. The difference lies in intention. You are not hiding because you are afraid of being seen. You are choosing consciously what serves the moment and what can wait. And you remain fully capable of speaking plainly and directly when directness is exactly what the situation requires. The people who wield real influence are rarely the ones who say the most in a room. They are, far more often, the ones whose words carry weight precisely because those words are chosen, not spent freely. When you say less than you know, you preserve options that full disclosure forecloses. You invite others to reveal themselves while you remain harder to read. And you cultivate a kind of quiet authority that talkative rooms rarely produce. Silence, used this way, is not the absence of communication. It is one of its most precise instruments. Chapter 3. The Code of Patience. There is a particular kind of loss that comes from being right too early. You see the shift before others do. You understand the opportunity before it's obvious. You sense the moment someone's position is about to weaken, and you act immediately, certain that speed is an advantage. Often it is not. Acted on too soon, correct insight collapses into premature moves that alert others, invite resistance, or simply arrive before the conditions exist to support them. The people who wield influence most effectively are rarely the fastest to act. They are the ones who have trained themselves to hold a correct read on a situation without discharging it the moment it forms, waiting instead for the moment when the same move costs almost nothing, because circumstances have already done most of the work. Patience, understood this way, is not passivity, and it is not indecision dressed up as wisdom. It is a specific, disciplined form of restraint. The ability to see clearly what should eventually be done while declining to do it until timing has shifted the odds meaningfully in your favor. This distinction matters because patience is often confused with weakness, with an inability to commit and avoidance of risk. Properly practiced, it is closer to the opposite. It requires tolerating the discomfort of watching an opportunity sit unclaimed, resisting the anxious voice that insists someone else will seize it first, and trusting instead that a move made at the right moment accomplishes in one motion what an early, poorly timed move might struggle to achieve, even with repeated effort. Much of what looks like sudden success, viewed from a distance, is in fact the visible tip of a long, quiet accumulation of readiness that patience made possible. A negotiation appears to turn in a single afternoon, but the ground for that turn was prepared over months of positioning, relationship building, and waiting for the other side's circumstances to change in ways that made agreement easier than resistance. A promotion appears to arrive suddenly, but it followed a long period in which someone became visibly, undeniably ready before ever asking for it directly. Timing did not replace the work. It multiplied the effect of work that had already been done by releasing it at the moment it would land hardest. Learning to recognize the right moment requires paying close attention to conditions rather than to your own internal impatience, which is rarely a reliable guide. Ask before acting whether the people involved are currently receptive, distracted, defensive, or exhausted, because the same request, delivered into different conditions, produces entirely different outcomes. Ask whether acting now forces a decision before the other side has had time to arrive at it themselves, which often produces resistance, or whether waiting allows them to reach a conclusion that feels like their own choice, which produces far less friction and far more durable agreement. The content of the move rarely changes. Its reception changes enormously depending on when it arrives. There is also a defensive dimension to this code, easy to overlook. Patience protects you from being maneuvered into premature action by others, who may benefit from provoking a hasty response before you've had time to assess a situation fully. Pressure, urgency, and manufactured deadlines are common tools used specifically to strip patience away from an opponent, because a rushed decision is far easier to influence than a considered one. Recognizing this tactic when it is used against you, and refusing to be hurried simply because someone else has created a sense of urgency, is itself an exercise of this code, often as valuable as knowing when to act. None of this argues for endless delay. Patience without eventual action becomes its own failure, a comfortable excuse for avoiding the risk that any real move requires. The discipline being described here is not waiting indefinitely, but waiting precisely, holding a position, an insight, or a plan in reserve until the moment it can be deployed with maximum effect, and then moving decisively once that moment arrives. Timing, used this way, does not replace skill or preparation. It is what allows skill and preparation to actually be seen, felt, and remembered, rather than spent too early on a room that wasn't yet ready to receive them. Chapter 4. The Code of Detachment. There is a moment, familiar to anyone who has ever wanted something badly, when desire becomes visible on the face before a single word is spoken. The eagerness in the voice, the slight forward lean, the quickness to agree to terms that would ordinarily warrant hesitation, all of it announces, to anyone paying attention, that need has entered the room ahead of strategy. This is one of the most consistent ways that leverage is lost, not through any error of logic or preparation, but through the simple, almost involuntary broadcasting of how much something matters. The moment another party senses that you need an outcome more than they do, the terms of the exchange shift, often before either side has said so explicitly. Detachment, as a discipline, does not mean indifference. It does not require pretending you don't care about an outcome you genuinely want. And attempting that kind of performance usually fails anyway, because need has a way of surfacing in small, hard-to-control signals, a rushed sentence, an unnecessary justification, an eagerness to close the gap the moment resistance appears. Real detachment is built differently. It comes from having genuine alternatives, or at minimum, having done the internal work of accepting that this particular outcome, however desirable, is not the only path forward available to you. When that acceptance is real rather than performed, it changes your entire presence in the negotiation, because you are no longer secretly calculating what you cannot afford to lose. You are simply present, evaluating terms on their actual merits. This is why the strongest negotiating position is rarely built at the negotiating table itself. It is built beforehand, through the deliberate cultivation of options. A person with only one buyer for something they're selling negotiates from a position of quiet desperation, whether or not they manage to hide it. A person with 3 interested buyers negotiates from an entirely different place, because losing any single deal costs them comparatively little. The work of detachment, then, is largely preparatory. Before you enter any exchange where you want something from another party, ask what alternatives you have cultivated, and if the honest answer is none, recognize that this absence is itself the primary vulnerability you're bringing into the room, more significant, usually, than any weakness in your actual argument or position. There is a subtler version of this principle that applies even when alternatives are genuinely scarce. Detachment can also be built through reframing what a particular outcome actually means to you. Someone who has decided, in advance, that a failed negotiation is a disappointment rather than a catastrophe, carries themselves very differently than someone who has quietly convinced themselves that this deal, this job, this relationship is the only acceptable outcome. The second framing manufactures need even where circumstances don't strictly require it. And that manufactured need leaks out regardless of how carefully the words are chosen. Learning to hold desired outcomes loosely, wanting them fully, while remaining genuinely willing to walk away, is less a matter of talent than of deliberate mental preparation done well before the moment arrives. It is worth noting the mirror image of this code. Recognizing need in others is one of the most valuable forms of information available in any exchange. The party who reveals urgency, who cannot tolerate silence, who moves quickly to close a gap rather than let it sit, has told you something important about the leverage in the room, whether or not they meant to. This is not a cue for exploitation without conscience. Real influence, sustained over time, still depends on relationships that survive the transaction. But it is a cue for accurate calibration, allowing you to hold your own position with appropriate confidence, rather than conceding ground that the actual balance of need never required you to give up. Detachment, practiced consistently, produces a particular kind of steadiness that others notice even when they can't quite name it. Rooms respond differently to someone who clearly does not need the outcome in front of them, offering better terms, more respect, and less resistance than the same rooms offer someone visibly desperate for the same result. This is not because detachment makes you more deserving. It is because need, once revealed, invites exactly the kind of pressure that erodes the very outcome you were hoping to secure. Chapter 5. The Code of Read. Every strategy eventually fails against a person you have misjudged. You can plan an approach with great precision, anticipate objections, prepare exactly the right words for exactly the right moment, and still watch it collapse entirely because the person in front of you was never who you assumed them to be. This is the quiet failure point behind a great deal of wasted effort in negotiation, leadership, and persuasion. Elaborate technique applied to an inaccurate model of the person it was meant to work on. Before any of the codes in this book can be used with real precision, there is a prior task that most people skip in their eagerness to act. The patient, unglamorous work of actually understanding who you are dealing with. Reading a person accurately begins with setting aside the assumption that people are generally similar to you, motivated by what would motivate you, unsettled by what would unsettle you. This assumption feels natural because it requires no additional effort. It simply projects your own inner world onto someone else's. But it is frequently wrong, and it produces some of the most common errors in influence. Offering security to someone driven by ambition, offering status to someone who actually wants safety, appealing to logic with someone who decides almost entirely on feeling, and only justifies the decision with logic afterward. The read must be built from evidence specific to the person in front of you, not from a generic assumption about what people, in general, tend to want. This evidence is almost always available, if you know where to look. What does this person complain about most often? And what pattern runs underneath those complaints? What do they spend discretionary time and money on when no one is directing them otherwise? Who do they defer to, and who do they dismiss, and what does that reveal about what they respect? What topic makes them lean forward, and what topic makes them visibly retreat or change the subject? None of these signals, alone, tells you everything. Together, observed patiently over time, they begin to form a reliable picture of what actually drives someone, which is very often different from what they would tell you if asked directly. Not because people lie deliberately, but because most people have only partial insight into their own motivations. There is a useful distinction worth holding on to here: the difference between a person's stated position and their underlying interest. Stated positions are what people say they want: a specific number in a negotiation, a specific outcome in a dispute, a specific role in an organization. Underlying interests are the deeper needs that position is meant to satisfy: security, recognition, autonomy, belonging, control. Two people can hold identical stated positions while being driven by entirely different underlying interests, which means the same offer that moves one of them easily will leave the other completely unmoved. Reading a person well means learning to hear past the stated position to the interest underneath it. Because it is the interest, not the position, that actually determines what will persuade them. This code also requires a kind of humility that many people resist: the willingness to be wrong about your initial read and to revise it as new evidence arrives, rather than defending your first impression simply because you already committed to it. People are not static. Someone confident in one context may be deeply insecure in another. Someone generous in prosperity may become guarded under pressure. Treating an early read as a fixed, permanent conclusion rather than a working hypothesis is one of the more common ways influence efforts misfire. The approach that worked perfectly 6 months ago quietly stops working, and the reason is rarely that the technique failed. It is that the person changed, and the read was never updated to match. Understanding people before you move is, in the end, an act of respect as much as strategy. It requires actually paying attention to another human being as a specific, particular individual rather than as a category or a means to an end. Done well, it produces something beyond effective influence. It produces relationships in which people feel genuinely seen, which is itself one of the rarest and most persuasive experiences you can offer anyone. The codes that follow in this book will only ever be as accurate as the read they are built upon. Get the read right, and much of what comes next becomes far simpler than it would otherwise be. Part 2. Mastering Yourself. Chapter 6. The Code of Composure. There is a specific moment that determines more about a person's authority than almost anything else they do. The moment something goes wrong in front of others. A plan collapses mid-presentation, an insult lands in a meeting, bad news arrives without warning, and in that instant, before a single strategic word is spoken, the face has already communicated something to everyone watching. Alarm, defensiveness, panic, wounded pride. These register instantly and involuntarily, and they tell a room far more about a person's actual position than any words that follow. Composure, held in exactly this kind of moment, is one of the most immediate and least fakeable signals of authority a person can offer, which is precisely why it matters so much and why so few people manage to hold it. It is worth being precise about what composure actually is, because it is often confused with suppression. Suppression is forcing a feeling down, holding a tense, rigid mask over visible strain, and people can usually sense the effort underneath it, which reads as barely controlled distress rather than genuine calm. Composure is different. It is not the absence of feeling, but the refusal to let feeling dictate immediate, visible reaction. The frustration, the alarm, the sting of an insult can all be fully present internally, while the face and voice remain steady, unhurried, and clear. This distinction matters enormously in practice, because composure built on suppression eventually cracks under enough pressure, while composure built on genuine internal steadiness can hold through far greater difficulty. The room reads composure as information, whether or not anyone names it consciously. When a leader receives bad news and responds with visible panic, the room absorbs that panic and begins making decisions from a place of fear rather than clarity. When the same leader receives the same news and responds with calm, direct attention to what needs to happen next, the room borrows that calm, and decisions that follow tend to be clearer and better made. This is not because the leader's composure changed the actual severity of the situation. It changed the emotional climate in which everyone else was about to think and act. And that climate has enormous practical consequences, often more than the original event itself. Building this capacity requires practice with smaller stakes before it can be relied upon in larger ones. It is unrealistic to expect composure to appear fully formed the first time it is truly tested under significant pressure, if it has never been deliberately exercised in smaller moments beforehand. This means treating minor daily frustrations, a delayed response, an unexpected criticism, a small plan gone wrong, as low-stakes training ground. In each of these moments, there is a brief window between the trigger and the reaction, and that window can be deliberately widened through repeated practice. Noticing the urge to react instantly and choosing instead to pause, breathe, and respond from a place slightly more considered than the first impulse offers. There is also a strategic dimension to composure worth naming plainly. A person who reacts visibly and predictably to provocation becomes easy to manipulate, because their reactions can be triggered on demand by anyone who has learned which buttons produce which responses. A person who has developed genuine composure is far harder to provoke into a reaction that serves someone else's agenda, because the space between stimulus and response gives them room to choose deliberately rather than react automatically. This is one of the quieter forms of protection composure offers. It removes a lever that others might otherwise use against you, simply by declining to hand over an automatic, predictable reaction they could learn to exploit. None of this means composure should be constant or robotic, indistinguishable from coldness. There is a real difference between someone who is composed and someone who has simply gone numb. And rooms sense that difference too. Genuine warmth, humor, and emotional presence remain fully compatible with composure, and in fact tend to make it more compelling rather than less. What composure asks you to control is not your inner life, but your immediate, unfiltered reaction to disruption. Master that single skill, practiced consistently over time in situations both small and significant, and you will find that a great deal of the authority people spend years chasing through other means begins, quietly, to arrive on its own. Chapter 7. The Code of Restraint. There is a specific kind of victory that costs more than it wins. Someone provokes you, deliberately or carelessly, and you respond with the full force the provocation seemed to deserve, a sharp reply, a public correction, a decisive move to put them in their place. In the moment, it feels like strength. Afterward, more often than people expect, it reveals itself as the opposite. A reaction so disproportionate to the original offense that it becomes a story people remember. And you become, in that memory, the person who couldn't hold their composure, rather than the person who was wronged. Overreaction is one of the most reliable ways that real power quietly bleeds out of a person's hands, precisely because it feels, at the time, like the assertion of power rather than its erosion. The mechanism behind this is worth understanding clearly. Every reaction sends information about your thresholds, what provokes you, how much force you're willing to use, how easily your composure can be disrupted. A measured response reveals very little of this. It simply addresses the situation and moves on, leaving observers with limited insight into what would actually rattle you. An overreaction reveals everything at once. It shows exactly how much pressure is required to produce a strong response, which is precisely the information anyone hoping to provoke or manipulate you in the future would want to have. In this sense, restraint is not merely about appearing calm. It is about protecting information that, once given away, cannot easily be taken back. There is also a proportionality problem, specific to overreaction, that most people underestimate until they've lived through its consequences. A minor slight met with a minor, measured response tends to resolve itself and fade from memory relatively quickly. The same minor slight met with a disproportionate response often escalates the entire situation, drawing in more attention, more parties, and more scrutiny than the original offense ever warranted on its own. The overreaction becomes the larger event, eclipsing whatever provoked it, and observers, who rarely have full context for what led to the response, tend to judge the visible reaction more harshly than the invisible provocation that caused it. This is not fair, but it is remarkably consistent across nearly every social and professional context, and it is worth planning around rather than resenting. Restraint, properly understood, does not mean tolerating genuine mistreatment indefinitely or failing to address real problems directly. There is an important difference between restraint and passivity, and confusing the two leads to its own kind of damage. A pattern of absorbing disrespect without ever addressing it, which eventually erodes authority just as surely as overreaction does, only more slowly and less visibly. The discipline being described here is not silence in the face of every provocation. It is calibration, matching the size of your response to the actual significance of the situation, rather than to the intensity of the emotion it happened to trigger in you in the moment. A serious violation may genuinely call for a serious, direct, even forceful response. Restraint simply ensures that response is chosen deliberately, based on what the situation actually requires, rather than fired reflexively from wounded pride or momentary anger. Developing this capacity requires building in a deliberate delay between provocation and response, particularly in situations charged with strong emotion. The instinct to reply immediately, especially in writing, a sharp email, a heated message, is almost always worth resisting long enough to let the initial emotional charge settle. What feels essential to say in the first few minutes after a provocation very often looks different an hour later, and different again the next morning. This is not weakness or indecision. It is the practical application of a simple, well-tested principle. Decisions made in the grip of strong emotion are rarely the same decisions a calmer version of yourself would choose. And the version making the decision in that heated moment is usually not the version whose judgment you actually want representing you. The people who hold real influence over time are rarely those who respond to every provocation with maximum force. They are the ones who have learned to absorb minor friction without visible disturbance, reserving genuine, forceful response for the moments that truly warrant it. And because that force is used so selectively, it carries far more weight when it finally does appear. Restraint, practiced this way, is not the suppression of power. It is power held in reserve, which is very often more effective and certainly more sustainable than power spent on every provocation that happens to come along. Chapter 8. The Code of Discipline. There is a kind of trust that cannot be argued into existence, no matter how persuasive the words used to build it. It can only be earned through repetition, through a pattern of behavior consistent enough over a long enough period that others begin to make reliable predictions about how you will act before you've acted at all. This predictability, so often undervalued in favor of more dramatic displays of competence or charisma, is one of the quietest and most durable sources of authority available to anyone. People do not follow, trust, or defer to those they cannot predict, regardless of how impressive that person's occasional brilliance might be. They follow those whose behavior has, over time, become dependable enough to build plans around. Discipline, in this sense, is not primarily about willpower or grinding effort, though it requires both. It is about the accumulation of small, consistent choices that, individually, seem almost too minor to matter, but that compound over months and years into something that looks, from the outside, like an entirely different order of capability. The person who shows up prepared to every meeting, who follows through on every commitment made even when circumstances have shifted and the commitment is now inconvenient. Who maintains the same standard of work whether or not anyone is watching. This person builds a kind of authority that cannot be replicated by talent or charm alone, because it rests on something talent and charm cannot fake. A demonstrated pattern, verified across time, that cannot be produced through a single strong performance. This matters more than it might initially seem, because most environments are full of people who are occasionally excellent and unreliably so. Brilliant in bursts, inconsistent in follow-through, impressive in the moment and forgettable soon after. Against this backdrop, steady, unglamorous consistency becomes disproportionately valuable. Precisely because it is comparatively rare. Leaders learn quickly who can be handed a task without needing to check on it, and who requires constant supervision despite occasional flashes of impressive work. Over time, the first category accumulates responsibility, trust, and influence, at a rate the second category, however talented, rarely matches. There is a particular test of discipline worth naming directly, because it reveals more than almost any other. How a person behaves when the effort required exceeds the immediate reward, and no one else would notice if they cut corners. Genuine discipline holds the same standard in this unwatched moment as it does in the most visible one. This is difficult precisely because it offers no immediate external reinforcement. No one applauds the version of you that does the harder, more thorough version of a task that no one was checking on. But this is exactly where discipline compounds into character rather than performance. Because a standard maintained only when observed is not actually a standard. It is a display, and displays, however convincing in the moment, tend to fail exactly when they matter most, under pressure, when observation lapses, or when the cost of maintaining them rises. Discipline also functions as a form of self-trust that becomes visible to others indirectly. A person who has kept commitments to themselves. The early mornings, the difficult conversations they didn't avoid, the standards they held even when it would have been easier not to, carries a particular kind of internal steadiness into every room they enter. This steadiness is difficult to describe precisely, but easy to sense. It reads as someone who is not performing confidence, but has actually built it, brick by brick, through a private history of following through on what they said they would do. Others, even without knowing the specific history behind it, tend to respond to this steadiness with a deference that is rarely extended to those who lack it, however skilled those people may otherwise be. Building this kind of discipline does not require dramatic transformation or extraordinary willpower applied all at once. It requires choosing, repeatedly, in small and often unremarkable moments, to do what was said would be done, to maintain the standard that circumstances make tempting to lower, and to treat consistency itself as a form of respect toward others, and toward the version of yourself capable of becoming genuinely reliable. Over time, this accumulation becomes its own quiet authority, one that requires no announcement and no persuasion, because it has already been demonstrated patiently, one dependable choice at a time. Chapter 9. The Code of Humility. There is a particular kind of insecurity that hides in plain sight, disguised as confidence. It shows up in the constant need to mention accomplishments unprompted, to correct others in front of a group when a quiet word later would have served just as well, to steer nearly every conversation back toward one's own competence. This behavior is often mistaken, by the person doing it, for strength, a demonstration of value meant to secure respect. In practice, it tends to produce the opposite effect. Rooms are remarkably perceptive about the difference between someone who is genuinely secure in their capability and someone who needs constant reassurance of it. And they extend real deference almost exclusively to the former. Humility, understood correctly, is not self-deprecation, and it is not the suppression of genuine achievement out of some misplaced sense that talent should be hidden. Both of those postures are, in their own way, still a form of preoccupation with how one is perceived, just inverted. Real humility is something quieter and more structural. It is the absence of the compulsive need to have your value confirmed by others in every interaction. A person who is genuinely secure in their capability does not need to mention it, because their sense of it does not depend on external validation gathered in real time. This security frees an enormous amount of attention that insecure competence spends on self-promotion, attention that can instead go toward the actual work, the actual people in the room, and the actual problem at hand. This distinction has significant practical consequences in how influence is built. A person who constantly announces their own value invites scrutiny of that value, because the announcement itself creates an opening for comparison and doubt. People begin quietly measuring the claim against the evidence. And claims made this frequently rarely hold up perfectly under that kind of ongoing audit. A person who says little about their own accomplishments and simply lets the work speak, over time, avoids this scrutiny almost entirely, because there was no claim made to test in the first place, only results observed directly, which are far harder to argue with than any amount of self-description. There is also a particular kind of power available to someone practicing genuine humility that is unavailable to someone constantly asserting status. The ability to let others feel important in your presence without it costing you anything real. Someone secure enough not to need constant recognition can afford to give recognition generously, crediting a colleague's contribution fully, asking genuine questions and listening to the answers without steering the conversation back to themselves, allowing someone else to be right in a minor disagreement that doesn't actually matter. This generosity, extended consistently, builds a particular kind of loyalty and goodwill that status-seeking behavior actively undermines, because people remember, often more than they remember cleverness, how they were made to feel in someone's presence. It is worth being precise about where humility ends and self-erasure begins, because the two are frequently confused, particularly by people who have been taught that modesty requires minimizing their own contributions entirely. Genuine humility does not mean failing to advocate for yourself when advocacy is warranted, does not mean accepting credit that belongs to you being quietly redirected elsewhere, and does not mean staying silent when speaking up would serve the situation or the people depending on you. It means simply that this advocacy, when it happens, is measured, factual, and free of the anxious over-assertion that reveals insecurity rather than confidence. You can state your contribution plainly, once, clearly, without needing to repeat it, defend it excessively, or dress it up beyond what the facts themselves support. Strength that does not announce itself tends to be trusted more readily than strength that constantly does, because the announcement itself introduces a question the silence never raises. Practiced consistently, this code produces an authority that feels almost paradoxical. The less a person insists on their own importance, the more that importance tends to be recognized by others, freely and without prompting, precisely because it was never something they seemed to need. Chapter 10. The Code of Reserve. There is a particular kind of exposure that comes from giving everything away at once. Every idea in the first meeting, every card in the first hand, every piece of insight the moment it occurs to you. It often comes from good intentions, enthusiasm, generosity, a genuine desire to be helpful or to prove capability quickly. But full disclosure, offered too early and too completely, tends to leave a person with nothing held in reserve for the moments that actually require it. This chapter is not an argument for secrecy as a way of life. It is an argument for a specific, disciplined habit. Never operating entirely at capacity, never revealing the full extent of what you know, have, or are capable of in any single exchange. The logic behind this becomes clearer once you consider what reserve actually protects against. Situations shift. The plan that seemed complete in the morning meeting looks different by the afternoon. Once new information arrives, the offer that seemed generous when made looks less so once circumstances change and more is suddenly required. A person who has committed everything up front, every resource, every piece of leverage, every argument, has nothing left to adjust with when conditions move, which they reliably do. A person who has kept something back retains the flexibility to respond to a changed situation without having to manufacture new leverage from nothing, under pressure, in real time. This principle applies as much to information and ideas as it does to resources or leverage. Sharing every insight the moment it occurs, in full detail, often feels like generosity or competence on display. But it also removes any advantage that insight might have provided later, once its value could be demonstrated rather than simply described. A person who consistently reveals their full thinking immediately becomes, over time, entirely predictable. Easy to anticipate, easy to plan around, easy to outmaneuver, because there is nothing left unaccounted for. A person who reveals thinking selectively, sharing what a given moment requires and holding the rest, remains harder to fully map, which is itself a form of protection in any environment where others are, consciously or not, trying to understand and predict your next move. There is a useful distinction here between reserve and dishonesty, worth drawing carefully. Reserve does not mean misrepresenting your position, your capabilities, or your intentions. It means simply declining to disclose everything you could disclose. Choosing instead what serves the moment while keeping additional depth available for later. A skilled negotiator does not lie about what they're willing to accept. They simply don't reveal their full range immediately, preserving room to make later concessions that feel meaningful rather than starting from a position with nowhere left to move. A capable professional does not overstate their abilities. They simply let some of that capability remain unseen until circumstances call for it, so that their eventual demonstration of it lands with real impact rather than being expected, already discounted, because it was announced too far in advance. This code also functions as a form of psychological steadiness that serves you internally, not just strategically toward others. Someone who has committed every resource, financial, emotional, intellectual, to a single position or outcome, tends to experience that position with a kind of fragile intensity, because there is nothing held back to fall on if it doesn't work out. Someone who has maintained genuine reserve, even in situations they care about deeply, carries a steadier internal state, because part of their capacity always remains untouched by the outcome of any single exchange. This steadiness is often visible to others, and it reads correctly as a kind of quiet confidence that full exposure rarely produces. Practicing reserve does not mean withholding warmth, connection, or generosity from the people who have earned your trust over time. Reserve applied indiscriminately becomes its own kind of dysfunction, isolating rather than protective. It means developing the habit, particularly in unfamiliar or high-stakes situations, of asking what portion of your full position genuinely needs to be shown right now, and declining to offer the rest simply because it would be easy or satisfying to do so in the moment. Keep something back, always, not out of distrust, but out of respect for how unpredictable circumstances actually are, and how much more capable you remain when part of your hand has never been shown. Part 3. Shaping Perception. Chapter 11. The Code of Presence. There is a particular kind of attention a room gives certain people before those people have said a single word. It is not about volume, and it is rarely about the loudest person in the room at all. Often the opposite. It is a quality that precedes speech. The way someone enters, the stillness they carry, the sense that their attention, when it eventually arrives on you, will be full and undivided rather than distracted or performed. This quality is commonly called presence. and it is one of the most consistently underestimated forms of influence. Precisely because it operates almost entirely below the level of words. In a register most people never learn to notice, let alone cultivate deliberately. Presence begins with the body. Though most discussions of influence focus almost exclusively on language. How a person occupies space communicates before language has the chance to. Someone who enters a room with rushed, apologetic movement, eyes darting for approval, already signals a certain relationship to their own authority before speaking. Someone who enters at an unhurried pace, makes brief, settled eye contact, and takes up exactly the amount of space their presence warrants. No more, no less. Signals something entirely different. And the room responds to that signal before any content has been exchanged. This is not about performing dominance through exaggerated posture, which reads as insecure overcompensation nearly as quickly as timidity does. It is about genuine, physical settledness, the kind that cannot easily be faked because it depends on an internal state, not merely an external pose. This internal state matters more than any particular technique of posture or movement, because the body tends to reveal what is actually happening internally, regardless of conscious effort to control it. A person who is genuinely at ease in their own competence and their own right to occupy the space they're in carries that ease into a room in ways that are difficult to describe precisely but easy for others to sense. A kind of settledness in the shoulders, an unhurried quality to movement and speech, an absence of the small, anxious adjustments, excessive smiling, unnecessary apologizing, constant checking for reaction, that signal uncertainty about one's own standing. Presence, in this sense, is less a skill to be performed and more a byproduct of genuine internal security, which is why attempts to fake it convincingly, absent that underlying security, so often fall short. There is also a quality of attention involved in presence that deserves particular focus, because it is one of the most overlooked and most powerful components of the entire code. Most people, in conversation, are partially elsewhere, thinking about their next point, checking a phone, scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. A person who offers full, undivided attention to whoever is in front of them, however briefly, creates an experience that has become genuinely rare. And rarity here produces real impact. People remember, often more vividly than they remember what was said, how completely they were attended to in a given exchange. This undivided attention costs nothing tangible to offer, and yet functions as one of the most persuasive gestures available, precisely because so few people offer it consistently. Presence also depends heavily on the management of urgency. A person who reacts to every interruption, every incoming request, every shift in the room with visible haste signals that they are not fully in control of their own attention, which subtly undermines authority even if their competence is otherwise unquestioned. A person who moves through disruption at a measured pace, finishing a thought before pivoting, acknowledging an interruption without being derailed by it, signals a kind of command over their own environment that others read, correctly, as a form of quiet strength. This measured pace is not slowness for its own sake. It is the visible expression of someone who is not being pulled around by every external demand on their attention. Cultivating presence, ultimately, is less about learning specific behaviors to display, and more about doing the underlying work that makes those behaviors natural rather than performed. The observation, composure, restraint, and reserve described in the codes preceding this one. Presence is, in many ways, the visible surface where all of those internal disciplines become perceptible to others, often before a word has been exchanged. A room does not need to be told that a person is capable, prepared, and secure. Given genuine presence, it simply senses it and adjusts its attention accordingly, well before the conversation has even properly begun. Chapter 12. The Code of Scarcity. There is a peculiar feature of human perception, well documented across markets, relationships, and social hierarchies alike. Value is rarely assessed in isolation. It is assessed relative to availability. The same person, offering the same insight, the same time, the same attention, is perceived very differently depending on how freely that offering is given. Available constantly, without limit, without any friction required to access it, even genuine value tends to be discounted, absorbed into the background, taken for granted. Made available more selectively, the identical offering is suddenly noticed, weighed, and often pursued with real effort. This is not a flaw in human judgment so much as a deeply ingrained heuristic. Scarcity is read, often unconsciously, as a signal of value, while abundance is read as a signal of its absence. This code is frequently misunderstood as an instruction toward artificial withholding, manufacturing scarcity where none genuinely exists, purely as a manipulative tactic. That version of the principle tends to collapse under scrutiny, because people are generally capable of sensing when scarcity is performed rather than real. And the perception of manipulation, once triggered, undermines trust far more than any short-term gain from the tactic could offset. What is being described here is something more foundational. Understanding that constant, unlimited availability of your time, attention, opinions, or presence actively erodes how those things are valued, and adjusting your default behavior accordingly, not through manufactured games, but through genuine discipline about what you make available, to whom, and how often. Consider how this plays out in ordinary professional life. A person who responds to every message within minutes, who is available for every meeting regardless of relevance, who says yes to every request without discernment, quickly becomes someone whose time appears to carry little cost, because it apparently costs nothing to obtain. A person who is thoughtful and selective about where their attention goes, who has boundaries around their availability that are respected because they are consistently maintained, signals through this behavior alone that their time is a resource worth managing carefully, which is precisely the message that makes others manage their requests for it more carefully as well. The content of what is offered may be identical in both cases. The perceived value differs enormously, driven almost entirely by the pattern of access surrounding it. The same principle extends into how opinions and insight are valued. A person who offers a view on every subject, freely and immediately, whenever the topic arises, dilutes the weight any single opinion carries. The audience has learned that commentary flows constantly and effortlessly, and effortless commentary tends to be received as exactly that. A person who is more measured, who reserves their perspective for moments that genuinely warrant it, finds that when they do speak, the room listens with noticeably more attention, simply because the pattern established beforehand has trained that attention to expect something considered rather than automatic. This code carries a defensive application worth naming explicitly, recognizing when scarcity is being used against you deliberately by others. Manufactured urgency, artificial deadlines, and the sense that an opportunity is uniquely rare and about to disappear are common tools used specifically to trigger the scarcity heuristic and short-circuit careful evaluation. Recognizing this pattern, asking directly whether the scarcity being presented to you is genuine or performed, protects against decisions made from manufactured pressure rather than from an accurate read of the actual situation. The same principle that builds your own value, used against you, is designed to make you overvalue something that may not deserve it. It is worth being clear about the boundary of this code, because taken too far, scarcity curdles into unavailability that reads as coldness or unreliability rather than value. The goal is not to become perpetually inaccessible, which produces its own damage to relationships and trust over time. It is to maintain genuine discernment about what you make freely available and what you reserve. Understanding that this discernment, consistently practiced, shapes how your time, attention, and insight are perceived far more powerfully than any argument you could make directly for their worth. Value, in the end, is rarely stated convincingly. It is demonstrated through the pattern of access surrounding whatever is being valued, and that pattern is almost entirely within your control. Chapter 13. The Code of Mystery. There is a particular kind of fascination that dissolves the moment a person becomes fully predictable. Once every reaction can be anticipated, every opinion already known in advance, every story already told, curiosity about that person quietly ends, not because they have become less capable or less likable, but because there is simply nothing left to discover. Human attention is drawn, consistently and almost involuntarily, toward what remains partially unknown. This is not a flaw in how people relate to one another. It is a basic feature of interest itself, and it has direct consequences for anyone hoping to sustain influence over time rather than simply produce a strong first impression that fades once familiarity sets in. Mystery, in this context, does not mean deception, and it does not mean constructing a false persona designed to seem more interesting than the reality underneath it. That approach tends to collapse under sustained contact, because maintaining a fabricated version of yourself requires constant effort and eventually produces inconsistencies that undermine trust far more seriously than simple ordinariness would have. What is being described here is something more sustainable. The discipline of not disclosing everything about yourself simply because disclosure is possible, and understanding that selective revelation, maintained over time, keeps you interesting in a way that total transparency, however well-intentioned, tends to erode. Consider how this operates in the earliest stages of any relationship, professional or personal. Attraction and interest are built, in large part, on a kind of productive incompleteness. Enough is revealed to create genuine connection, while enough remains unrevealed to sustain curiosity about what else there might be to learn. A person who discloses their complete history, every opinion, every vulnerability, within the first few encounters, often produces an initial sense of closeness. But that closeness tends to plateau quickly, because there is nothing left held in reserve to deepen the relationship further over time. A person who reveals themselves more gradually, allowing genuine discovery to unfold across a longer arc, sustains interest for considerably longer, because each new piece of information continues to feel like an earned reveal rather than an exhausted resource. This principle extends beyond personal relationships into how competence and capability are perceived more broadly. A person whose full skill set, opinions, and thinking are entirely visible from the outset becomes, in a sense, fully mapped. Colleagues and competitors alike know exactly what to expect, which limits how much genuine surprise and therefore how much genuine impact that person can produce later. A person who reveals capability more selectively, allowing certain strengths to remain undemonstrated until the moment they matter most, retains a kind of strategic depth that full early disclosure forecloses. This is not about hiding weakness or misrepresenting ability. It is about resisting the urge to show everything simply because showing it would be satisfying or would earn immediate recognition, and choosing instead to let some of it surface only when the timing genuinely serves you. There is also a protective function to maintaining a degree of mystery, worth naming directly. A person who is fully known in every dimension becomes correspondingly easy to predict, manage, and, when necessary, manipulate, because there is no remaining uncertainty about how they will respond to a given situation. Retaining some genuine unpredictability, some dimension of yourself that remains unmapped even by people who know you fairly well, preserves a kind of freedom of movement that total transparency surrenders. This does not require actively concealing information when directness is called for. It requires simply not volunteering the entirety of your internal world by default. Understanding that some things are better left to be discovered, inferred, or simply left unknown. The boundary of this code matters as much as its application. Mystery pursued too aggressively becomes aloofness, and aloofness, unlike genuine mystery, tends to read as coldness or untrustworthiness rather than intrigue. People generally will not invest curiosity in someone who seems entirely closed off, only in someone who is warm and engaged while still retaining some genuine depth beneath the surface. The goal, then, is not concealment for its own sake, but a disciplined resistance to the reflex of total disclosure, paired with real warmth in whatever is actually shared. Practiced this way, mystery becomes less a wall and more a horizon, something that draws continued attention precisely because it suggests there is always more worth discovering, one measured revelation at a time. Chapter 14. The Code of Reputation. There is a fundamental asymmetry in how influence actually spreads. Almost no one is persuaded as effectively by what a person says about themselves as they are by what other people say about that person when they are not in the room. Self-description, however accurate, carries an inherent bias that listeners instinctively discount, because everyone understands that people have reasons to present themselves favorably. A colleague's unprompted account of your reliability, offered to a third party with nothing to gain from the endorsement, carries a credibility that no amount of self-promotion can replicate. This is the quiet mechanism behind reputation, and it explains why the most durable forms of influence are rarely built through direct claims about oneself, but through the patient, often invisible work of becoming the kind of person whose name others are willing to carry forward on your behalf. This code requires a shift in where effort is actually directed. Most people, when they want to be seen as capable, focus their energy on the moments when they are being directly observed. The presentation, the interview, the meeting where a decision maker is present. This instinct is understandable but incomplete, because it treats reputation as something built primarily in the room, when in fact reputation is built primarily in the rooms you are not in. In the conversations that happen afterward, when someone describes what it was like to work with you to someone else who wasn't there. The person who understands this invests real effort into interactions that seem, on the surface, to offer no immediate audience worth impressing. The assistant, the junior colleague, the person with no obvious power to reward or punish. These are precisely the interactions most likely to generate the unprompted, credible testimony that reputation actually depends on. There is a particular danger worth naming directly: the temptation to manage reputation through direct intervention, correcting misperceptions publicly, defending against criticism loudly, or actively campaigning for a particular story about yourself to spread. This approach tends to backfire because it makes the effort visible, and visible effort to shape perception is itself perceived as suspicious, undermining exactly the credibility it was meant to build. Reputation managed this directly stops functioning as reputation at all and starts to resemble propaganda, which audiences are generally skilled at recognizing and discounting accordingly. The more effective approach is almost entirely indirect, consistently behaving in ways that generate the reputation you want, and then trusting that pattern to circulate on its own through the natural, unprompted conversations people have about one another when no one is managing the narrative. This indirection extends to how credit itself should be handled, which is one of the more counterintuitive aspects of building durable reputation. A person who consistently gives credit away, naming the colleague who actually solved the problem, acknowledging the team rather than claiming individual success, deflecting praise toward those who contributed, appears, in any single instance, to be sacrificing recognition. Over time, this pattern produces the opposite effect. People notice who gives credit generously, and that noticing becomes itself a story people tell about the credit giver. This is someone secure enough not to need it, generous enough to share it, trustworthy enough to be believed when they do offer praise to others. The recognition sacrificed in any single moment tends to return, amplified through the reputation this generosity builds over a much longer arc. There is also real value in recognizing that reputation, once established, becomes remarkably durable and self-reinforcing, for better and for worse. A strong, positive reputation tends to produce generous interpretations of ambiguous behavior, because people extend the benefit of the doubt to those whose track record has already earned trust. A damaged reputation produces the opposite effect, where even genuinely well-intentioned actions are interpreted skeptically, filtered through a prior story that colors everything that follows. This asymmetry underscores why the early, patient work of reputation building matters so much. The investment made before it is urgently needed determines how much benefit of the doubt is available in the moments when it actually is. Letting others carry your name forward requires a kind of patience that direct self-promotion does not. a willingness to do good work, treat people well, and give credit generously without an immediate, visible return. Trusting that the return arrives later, indirectly, in rooms you will never personally witness. This delay is precisely why so many people abandon the practice in favor of more direct self-advocacy. But reputation built slowly, through consistent behavior rather than persistent claims, tends to outlast almost any other form of influence, because it does not depend on anyone believing you. It depends only on what others have already seen for themselves and chosen on their own to repeat. Chapter 15. The Code of Framing. The same set of facts can produce entirely different conclusions depending on the frame placed around them before anyone has had time to interpret them independently. A price increase can be described as adjusting to inflation or squeezing customers. And both descriptions can be technically accurate while producing completely opposite emotional responses. A person who leaves a role can be described as pursuing new opportunities or pushed out. And the frame chosen first tends to become the frame that sticks, because most people do not have the time, motivation, or independent access to information required to construct their own interpretation from scratch. They accept the first coherent story offered to them, provided it arrives with enough confidence and enough plausibility to feel settled. This is the mechanism behind framing, and it explains why the person who offers the first clear narrative around an ambiguous event usually retains significant control over how that event is ultimately understood, regardless of what actually happened. This code carries an uncomfortable implication worth stating plainly. If you do not actively frame significant events that concern you, someone else will frame them instead, and that frame will rarely be as generous to you as the one you might have offered yourself. Silence, in ambiguous situations, is rarely neutral. It is simply an invitation for someone else's interpretation to fill the vacuum. And once a frame has taken hold and circulated, it becomes considerably harder to dislodge than it would have been to establish in the first place. This is why waiting to respond until a damaging narrative has already spread, and then attempting to correct it after the fact, is a fundamentally weaker position than offering a clear, honest frame proactively, before ambiguity gives others the opening to construct one less favorable. Effective framing does not require distorting the underlying facts, and attempts to do so tend to collapse once scrutinized, producing far more damage than an honest frame ever would have. What framing actually involves is choosing, deliberately, which true aspects of a situation to emphasize and in what order, and choosing the language that surrounds those facts with care. A project that fell short of its original target can be honestly framed either around the shortfall or around what was genuinely learned and built in the process. Both frames are true, but they lead listeners toward very different conclusions about what the experience actually means and about the person or team responsible for it. Choosing the frame is not lying about the facts. It is exercising legitimate influence over which true facts receive the most attention. There is a particular skill involved in framing that separates competent practice from clumsy manipulation. Framing works best when it is offered early, calmly, and without obvious defensiveness, because a frame that arrives as visible damage control reads as exactly that, and undermines its own credibility in the process. The most effective frames often sound almost understated, a brief, matter-of-fact account offered before speculation has had room to grow, rather than an elaborate justification offered after the fact, which signals, through its very elaborateness, that something is being defended against. Simplicity and early timing do more work in successful framing than clever language ever could. This code also requires attentiveness to frames being placed around you by others, particularly in situations where you have been slow to offer your own. Recognizing when a narrative about you or your work has begun to circulate, and assessing honestly whether that narrative is accurate, generous, or quietly damaging, is a necessary first step before any correction can be attempted. Once a frame has taken hold, direct contradiction is rarely the most effective response. It tends to reinforce the very narrative being contested. Since audiences remember the association even when the specific correction is technically believed, a better approach is usually to offer new information or new context that allows a more accurate frame to emerge naturally, without loudly announcing that a battle over interpretation is even taking place. Controlling the frame before it controls you is not about manipulating truth into something unrecognizable. It is about recognizing that facts alone rarely speak for themselves in the way people assume they will, and that meaning is constructed, deliberately or by default, through the frame placed around them. The choice available to you is rarely whether a frame will exist. It is only whether you will be the one who offers it, early and honestly, or whether you will spend considerable later effort trying to unseat a frame that someone else constructed first, while you were still deciding whether the situation required a response at all. Chapter 16. The Code of Confidence. There is a strange and well-documented pattern in how people evaluate competing claims. The strength of an argument's logic often matters less to a listener's final judgment than the certainty with which it is delivered. Two people can offer the same underlying reasoning, one hedged with qualifications and visible uncertainty, the other stated plainly and without apology. And audiences will consistently trust the second more, even when the first person's caution reflects a more accurate, more honest relationship to the actual complexity of the situation. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge because it suggests that persuasion often rewards certainty over accuracy. But understanding this pattern is essential, not as an excuse to overstate what you don't actually know, but as a guide for how to communicate what you do know without unnecessarily undermining it through reflexive hedging. Much of this hedging comes from good instincts gone slightly wrong. Careful, honest people often want to acknowledge the limits of their knowledge, the possibility of being mistaken, the existence of other valid perspectives. And this impulse toward intellectual honesty is genuinely admirable. The problem is not the underlying humility itself, but the way it frequently gets translated into speech. Constant qualifiers, apologetic framing, trailing off before a sentence has fully landed, presenting a well-reasoned position as though it were merely a tentative suggestion. This pattern, repeated consistently, trains listeners to discount what is being said before they've even fully evaluated its content, because the delivery itself has already signaled that the speaker doesn't fully trust their own conclusion. Confidence, as it is meant here, is not the same as certainty about outcomes you cannot actually control. and it is not the performance of knowing more than you do. Overclaiming certainty you don't possess is its own serious failure mode. One that eventually produces a credibility collapse far more damaging than occasional hedging ever would. Because it gets tested against reality and found wanting. What is being described instead is a discipline of stating what you do believe, based on the evidence and reasoning actually available to you, in plain, direct language, without burying a genuinely held conclusion under unnecessary qualification simply out of social discomfort with sounding too certain. There is a real difference between, "I think this might possibly be one reasonable approach, though I could be wrong," and "this is the approach I recommend, based on what we know." Both may reflect identical underlying reasoning and identical openness to being wrong if new evidence arrives. Only one of them will actually move a room. This code also depends heavily on tone and pacing, not merely word choice. A statement delivered quickly, at a slightly raised pitch toward the end, as though seeking approval, reads as uncertain even if the words themselves are declarative. The same statement delivered at a measured pace, with a settled, even tone and a full stop rather than a trailing question mark, reads as considered and confident. Much of what audiences interpret as confidence is, in practice, this kind of vocal and physical steadiness surrounding the words, rather than the literal content of the words themselves, which is precisely why two people can say almost identical things and be received in entirely different ways. There is an important safeguard worth building into this practice. Genuine confidence must remain updatable. The goal is not to become someone who states positions with unwavering certainty regardless of new information, which eventually produces exactly the kind of credibility collapse mentioned earlier. The goal is to state your current, well-reasoned position clearly and directly while you hold it, and to update it just as clearly and directly when genuinely new evidence warrants a change, without treating that update as an embarrassing reversal requiring extensive apology. A person capable of this combination, clear conviction paired with genuine openness to revision, tends to be trusted more over time than either the constant hedger or the person who never admits error. Because both consistency and honesty are visibly present in how they communicate. Certainty persuades where argument fails not because audiences are careless or unintelligent, but because most people, most of the time, are making rapid judgments with limited information and limited time to evaluate the underlying logic in full. In that environment, the manner of delivery becomes a meaningful signal in its own right, evidence in the listener's mind that the speaker has already done the careful thinking and arrived somewhere solid. Practiced honestly, without overreaching into false certainty, this code allows genuinely sound reasoning to actually land the way it deserves to, rather than being quietly discounted by a delivery that undersold it before it ever had a chance. Part 4. Building Leverage. Chapter 17. The Code of Value. There is a quiet but consequential difference between being well-liked and being genuinely necessary, and confusing the two is one of the more common miscalculations people make in their pursuit of influence. Being liked is pleasant, and it smooths a great deal of everyday interaction. But likability alone rarely survives a difficult decision. When resources are scarce, when choices must be made about who stays and who goes, who gets the opportunity and who doesn't. Likability is frequently the first consideration set aside in favor of a colder question. Who is actually essential to what needs to happen next? A person can be genuinely well-liked by an entire organization and still be the first let go when circumstances tighten, because being pleasant to work with, while valuable, is rarely the same as being difficult to replace. Becoming necessary requires a different kind of investment than becoming liked. It requires identifying, with real honesty, what specific problem you solve that others in your environment either cannot solve or solve less reliably than you do. This is uncomfortable work because it asks you to look past general competence, being a good, capable, hard-working person, which describes a great many people, and towards something more specific, a particular skill, a particular relationship, a particular piece of institutional knowledge, a particular judgment that others have come to rely on precisely because it is not easily found elsewhere. General competence is respected. Specific, hard-to-replace value is what actually generates leverage, because it changes the calculation anyone would need to make before deciding they could do without you. This distinction has direct implications for how time and effort should be allocated. Many people spend considerable energy trying to be broadly excellent across every dimension of their role, which produces a solid, well-rounded reputation, but rarely produces genuine necessity. Because well-rounded competence is, almost by definition, more replaceable than deep, specific expertise. A more strategic approach involves identifying the one or two areas where you can become genuinely difficult to replace. The person who understands a particular system no one else has bothered to learn, who holds a relationship that took years to build, who has developed judgment in a specific, valuable domain that took real time to earn, and investing disproportionate effort there, even if it means being merely adequate in areas that matter less to your actual leverage. There is also a relational dimension to becoming necessary that operates alongside the purely technical one. People become necessary not only through specific expertise, but through being the person others instinctively turn to when a situation is difficult, uncertain, or sensitive. The one who can be trusted to handle something delicate without making it worse. The one whose judgment is sought before a decision is finalized rather than only informed of it afterward. This kind of necessity is built slowly, through a consistent pattern of being genuinely useful in exactly the moments that matter most, rather than simply present in the moments that are easiest. It is worth being honest about the limits of this code, because pursued without any regard for relationship, becoming necessary can curdle into something brittle and resented, a person who hoards knowledge deliberately, who makes themselves indispensable through obstruction rather than genuine value, who is tolerated for their necessity but not trusted or respected alongside it. This version of necessity is fragile because it invites active efforts to root around the dependency it created, and it rarely survives contact with a determined enough effort to replace it. The more durable version of this code combines genuine, freely offered value with real necessity, becoming essential not because you have made yourself difficult to work around, but because what you offer is difficult to find anywhere else, offered generously rather than held hostage. Likability still matters, and nothing in this code argues for sacrificing warmth or collegiality in pursuit of leverage. In fact, necessity paired with likability produces the strongest position of all, because it combines genuine goodwill with genuine indispensability, leaving little incentive for anyone to look elsewhere even when circumstances tighten. But likability alone, without the harder-won foundation of specific, demonstrated necessity, remains a comparatively fragile form of standing. Becoming necessary is slower to build and asks more of you than simply being pleasant. It also tends to last considerably longer and to matter considerably more exactly when it counts. Chapter 18. The Code of Leverage. Every negotiation, every persuasive effort, every attempt to move another person toward a desired outcome depends on a single underlying question that is asked far less often than it should be. What does the other side actually need beneath what they're saying they want? Most people enter negotiations focused almost entirely on their own position, what they're hoping to get, what they're willing to concede, how they'll defend their own case. This focus is natural, but it is also one-sided in a way that quietly limits effectiveness. Because leverage is not built by understanding your own position more thoroughly. It is built by understanding the other side's position more thoroughly than they may understand it themselves. The distinction between a stated want and an underlying need is worth returning to here, because it is the foundation this entire code rests on. A stated want is what someone says they're asking for, a particular price, a particular deadline, a particular concession. An underlying need is the deeper problem that want is meant to solve, and it is frequently more flexible and more discoverable than the stated position suggests. A supplier insisting on a higher price may, underneath that number, actually need predictable cash flow more than they need that specific figure, which opens the possibility of a longer contract at a lower price that satisfies the real need just as well, or better, than the original demand. A colleague resisting a proposed change may not actually oppose the change itself, but fear losing visibility or control in the new arrangement, a need that can often be addressed directly, without requiring the change itself to be abandoned. Finding this underlying need requires a shift away from argument and toward genuine inquiry, which is a harder discipline than it sounds, because most people once engaged in negotiation default immediately into advocacy mode, building their case, anticipating objections, preparing counter-arguments, rather than into curiosity about what is actually driving the other side's position. Questions asked with real interest, rather than as a setup for the next argument, tend to surface information that direct argument never reaches, because people are far more willing to reveal their actual concerns to someone who appears genuinely interested in understanding them than to someone who appears to be building a case against them. Leverage, once the actual need is understood, often looks entirely different than it did when the situation was framed purely around the stated positions. Two parties who appear to be at an impasse over a single number frequently discover, once underlying needs are surfaced, that they were never actually in direct conflict at all. They wanted different things dressed up in the same language, and the appearance of conflict was an artifact of both sides arguing positions rather than communicating needs. This is why skilled negotiators spend a disproportionate amount of time in the early stages of any significant exchange simply asking questions and listening carefully to the answers. Resisting the urge to move quickly into proposal and counterproposal before the actual shape of the situation has been properly understood. There is a further layer to this code worth naming. Needs are not static, and they are not always fully known even to the person holding them. Sometimes the work of finding leverage involves helping the other side articulate a need they had not yet fully named to themselves, offering language and structure to something they had only vaguely felt as dissatisfaction or hesitation. This is not manipulation when done honestly. It is often experienced by the other party as genuinely useful clarity, and it tends to build trust rather than erode it. Because you have helped them understand their own situation more clearly, rather than exploited a need they were unaware of. It is worth stating plainly that finding what the other side needs is not solely a tool for extracting concessions in your own favor. Used well, it produces outcomes that genuinely serve both parties. Because a deal built around actual needs, rather than stated positions, tends to be more durable and more satisfying to everyone involved than a deal won through pressure applied to a position that never reflected what either side actually required. Leverage found this way is not adversarial by nature. It is simply accurate, an understanding of the real terrain beneath the negotiation, which almost always contains more room for genuine agreement than the surface-level positions initially suggested. Chapter 19. The Code of Positioning. Long before any negotiation, conversation, or contest of influence actually begins, its outcome is already being shaped by a factor most people never consciously consider: the ground on which it takes place. Not merely the physical location, though that matters more than most people realize, but the entire surrounding context, the timing, the audience present or absent, the framing already established, the relative comfort or discomfort each party brings into the exchange. Positioning is the discipline of choosing this ground deliberately, rather than accepting whatever ground circumstance happens to offer. Because the same argument, the same request, the same case made on favorable ground succeeds where it would have failed on unfavorable ground, regardless of the argument's actual merit. Consider how significantly outcomes shift depending on where a difficult conversation takes place. A request made in a colleague's office, on their territory, surrounded by the visible symbols of their authority, carries a different weight than the identical request made in a neutral space, or on ground where you hold more natural standing. A negotiation conducted immediately after the other side has just absorbed bad news unfolds very differently than the same negotiation conducted when they are calm, rested, and operating from a position of confidence. None of this changes the actual substance of what is being proposed. It changes the psychological conditions surrounding the proposal, and those conditions frequently determine the outcome as much as, or more than, the proposal's actual content. Positioning also applies to the order in which things are addressed, which is a dimension of ground control many people overlook entirely. Raising your most vulnerable point first, before trust or rapport has been established, invites a level of scrutiny that the same point might not receive later, once a foundation of agreement has already been built on easier ground. Conversely, opening with areas of clear alignment, allowing both parties to establish a rhythm of agreement, creates momentum that makes later, more difficult requests easier to introduce. Because the exchange has already been framed, implicitly, as one of cooperation rather than conflict. Skilled negotiators rarely leave this sequencing to chance. They choose deliberately what to raise first, what to hold until rapport has developed, and what to save until the very end, once the other side is already invested in reaching a positive outcome. There is a further dimension worth understanding. Positioning yourself relative to the choice itself, not merely relative to the room or the sequence. Presenting a single option invites a binary yes or no response, which frequently produces resistance, because refusal is always available and often feels safer than commitment. Presenting a small set of carefully constructed options, each of which serves your actual objective while offering the other party a genuine sense of choice, shifts the psychological ground considerably. The question is no longer whether to agree, but which version of agreement to select. This is not manipulation when the options offered are genuinely reasonable and honestly presented. It is simply a more sophisticated understanding of how choice architecture shapes decisions, used to create ground on which agreement becomes the natural, comfortable outcome rather than a contested one. Positioning requires preparation well before any exchange actually begins, which is precisely why it is so often neglected. Most people spend their preparatory effort on refining what they will say, and almost none on considering where, when, and in what sequence they will say it. Asking in advance, what timing would find the other party most receptive? What location would minimize unnecessary defensiveness? What should be addressed first to establish helpful momentum? And what should be held until trust has developed? Transforms a conversation from something reactive into something deliberately constructed. This preparation does not guarantee a favorable outcome. No code in this book offers guarantees, but it removes a significant, often decisive disadvantage. The disadvantage of engaging on ground chosen by circumstance, or worse, chosen deliberately by someone else, rather than ground chosen with intention by you. Choosing ground that favors you is not about manufacturing unfair advantage through trickery. It is about recognizing that context shapes outcome as powerfully as content does, and that most people, by failing to consider context deliberately, hand this entire dimension of influence away without ever realizing they had a choice in the matter at all. Chapter 20. The Code of Alliance. There is a limit to what any single person can accomplish alone, no matter how capable, disciplined, or well-positioned they are. And one of the more common errors in the pursuit of influence is treating this limit as something to push against, through sheer individual effort, rather than something to transcend through genuine alliance with others. A person acting entirely alone can outwork, outthink, and outmaneuver competitors for a time. But a coalition of aligned people, each contributing distinct strengths and distinct spheres of access, accomplishes what no individual effort could achieve regardless of talent. This is not a controversial claim in the abstract. Most people would readily agree that collaboration multiplies capability. What is less understood is how deliberately and how carefully genuine alliances actually need to be built, because they rarely form well by accident. The first mistake worth avoiding is treating alliance building as networking in its shallow, transactional sense. Collecting contacts, exchanging favors with an implicit ledger, cultivating relationships primarily for what they might eventually yield. This approach produces connections, but rarely produces genuine alliance, because the people involved can sense, often quite accurately, when a relationship exists mainly to extract future value rather than to build something mutual. Real alliances are built on a foundation closer to earned trust than to strategic proximity. A track record of showing up for someone before you needed anything from them, of sharing credit generously, of being reliable in small matters long before any large matter arose that required real loyalty to be tested. This foundation matters because alliances are tested precisely in the moments when they are least convenient to honor, when supporting an ally costs you something, when their interests and yours diverge slightly, when helping them requires spending capital you might have preferred to save for yourself. An alliance that has only ever been tested in easy, low-cost circumstances is not yet a real alliance. It is simply an untested assumption of one. The people whose loyalty proves durable under genuine cost are the allies worth investing in most heavily. And the only way to discover who those people are is through sustained relationship over time, not through a single impressive interaction or a well-crafted first impression. There is a strategic dimension to alliance worth understanding clearly. The most valuable allies are often not the most powerful people currently visible, but the people whose position, access, or trajectory complements your own in ways that are not yet fully apparent. A person still early in their career, but operating in a domain adjacent to yours with genuine talent and integrity, may become an extraordinarily valuable ally a decade later, long after more obviously powerful contacts from the same period have become irrelevant or moved on. Building alliance deliberately means investing attention broadly, not just toward whoever currently holds the most visible power, and doing so with genuine interest in the other person's success, rather than only in what they might eventually offer you. Reciprocity operates as the quiet engine beneath any durable alliance, though it functions best when it is never made explicit or transactional in the moment. Helping an ally without immediately calculating what should be owed in return, and trusting that genuine goodwill circulates back over time through channels you may never fully trace, produces far stronger alliance than any attempt to keep an even, visible ledger of favors given and received. The moment reciprocity becomes explicit and closely tracked, the relationship shifts from alliance into transaction. And transactions, however fair, rarely generate the kind of deep loyalty that genuine alliance produces when tested under real pressure. It is worth being honest about the limits and risks involved in this code. Alliances require real vulnerability, sharing information, extending trust, occasionally taking on risk on another person's behalf. And this vulnerability can be exploited by people who accept the benefits of alliance without ever intending to reciprocate it. Discernment about who genuinely deserves this investment, built through the patient observation described earlier in this book, protects against this risk far more effectively than either blanket suspicion or blanket trust. The goal is not naive generosity extended indiscriminately, but a deliberate, patient cultivation of a smaller number of genuine alliances, chosen carefully and maintained faithfully, which compound over years into a form of collective power that individual effort, however impressive, simply cannot replicate on its own. Chapter 21. The Code of Reciprocity. There is a psychological weight that settles on a person the moment they receive genuine, unprompted help from someone else. A quiet, often unconscious sense of imbalance that persists until something has been done to restore equilibrium. This reflex is deeply embedded, present across cultures and contexts in remarkably consistent form. And it functions as one of the most reliable forces in human relationships. More dependable in many ways than gratitude, affection, or even self-interest alone. A person who has genuinely helped you occupies a particular place in your mental accounting that is difficult to dismiss or forget. And this is precisely why reciprocity, understood and used with care, is one of the most durable forms of influence available, far more durable than persuasion built on argument alone, because it operates beneath conscious deliberation, in the same register as instinct and obligation. The mechanism behind this is worth understanding precisely. When someone extends genuine help, not a calculated transaction, but something offered without immediate demand for return, it creates what might be called an open loop in the recipient's mind. This loop generates a mild but persistent discomfort until it is closed, and it is closed, almost universally, through some act of return. A favor offered in kind, a strong recommendation, a willingness to go further than they otherwise might when the helper eventually needs something themselves. This is not primarily a calculated, conscious transaction on the recipient's part. It is closer to an emotional and social reflex, one that operates even in people who would consciously describe themselves as owing nothing to anyone. And it is precisely because this reflex operates below full conscious awareness that reciprocity functions so reliably as a foundation for influence. There is an important distinction between reciprocity used with integrity and reciprocity used as manipulation. And the difference lies almost entirely in intention and timing. Help offered with an implicit, immediate expectation of return. A favor performed loudly, followed quickly by a request, structured so the recipient feels cornered into repayment, tends to be recognized for what it is. And recognition of this kind poisons the exchange, converting what should build goodwill into something that instead breeds quiet resentment. Genuine reciprocity works differently. Help is offered because it is the right thing to do, or because you genuinely want to see the other person succeed, with no explicit expectation attached, and often no immediate ask ever made at all. The debt this creates is real, but it remains unspoken. And it is precisely this lack of explicit accounting that allows it to function so powerfully when eventually, sometimes much later, it is quietly called upon. Timing matters enormously in how this code operates. The help that is remembered most vividly, and that generates the strongest sense of obligation, is rarely help offered when it was easy or convenient to offer. It is help offered at genuine cost, time given up that could have gone elsewhere, risk taken on someone's behalf when the outcome was uncertain, support extended during a period when the giver had little obvious reason to bother. This kind of costly, well-timed generosity creates a far deeper impression than help that cost the giver nothing, because the recipient understands, even if unconsciously, that something real was actually sacrificed on their behalf. And this understanding is what transforms simple assistance into a debt that genuinely persists in memory. There is also a defensive dimension to this code worth naming clearly. Understanding reciprocity means understanding when it is being used against you, deliberately, to create an obligation you never consciously agreed to. Unsolicited favors, offered by people whose motives are unclear, followed eventually by requests that feel difficult to refuse precisely because of the earlier favor, represent a common and often effective manipulation. Recognizing this pattern allows you to evaluate a subsequent request on its actual merits, rather than through the distorting pressure of an unspoken debt someone else engineered deliberately. Gratitude for genuine kindness is appropriate and worth honoring. Compliance driven by manufactured obligation is not the same thing, and learning to distinguish between the two protects against a great deal of quiet manipulation that operates precisely through this code. Used with integrity, reciprocity becomes one of the most powerful and humane forms of influence available, because it rests on something genuinely good, real generosity, offered without demand, that naturally produces goodwill and loyalty in return. This is not a cynical exploitation of a psychological quirk. It is a recognition that helping others generously, consistently, and without excessive calculation is both the right way to move through the world and, as a quiet secondary effect, one of the most reliable ways to build lasting influence that no amount of clever argument could replicate on its own. Chapter 22. The Code of Access. There is a particular form of quiet power available to anyone positioned between others and something they genuinely want. A decision maker, an opportunity, a piece of information, a network of relevant relationships. This position, often overlooked because it does not resemble power in its more obvious, direct forms, can be more durable and more consistently useful than authority granted through title or formal position. Because it does not depend on the person holding it having any direct power over the outcome itself. It depends only on being positioned at a point others must pass through or engage favorably with, on their way toward something they need. Understanding and deliberately occupying such positions is the essence of this code, and it explains why certain people, without any obvious formal authority, nonetheless accumulate significant influence over time. Access, in this sense, takes many forms, and recognizing them requires looking past the most obvious version, literal, physical, or communicative access to a powerful individual, such as an assistant who controls a leader's calendar. That version is real and worth understanding, but it is only the most visible instance of a broader pattern. Access can also mean holding specialized knowledge others need, but cannot easily obtain elsewhere. Maintaining relationships within a community or industry that outsiders would need years to build independently. Or simply having accumulated enough credibility within a particular domain that an introduction or endorsement from you carries genuine weight. In each case, the underlying structure is the same. Something valuable exists on the other side of you, and reaching it efficiently requires engaging with you first, on terms at least partly of your choosing. This position creates a particular kind of leverage that operates differently than leverage built through direct authority. A person with formal power over an outcome can simply grant or deny it. But this directness also makes their power easy to identify, resent, and root around wherever possible. A person who controls access rather than the outcome itself occupies a subtler position. They are not making the final decision, only shaping who and what reaches the decision maker, or who gains entry into the relevant network. And this subtlety often allows access-based influence to persist even in environments where direct authority is closely watched, contested, or formally limited. Building this kind of position deliberately requires identifying where genuine bottlenecks exist within your particular domain. Points where demand for something valuable consistently exceeds easy supply, and where your accumulated knowledge, relationships, or credibility could plausibly occupy that narrow point of passage. This is rarely accomplished quickly. It typically requires years of consistent investment in a particular area, cultivating relationships within a specific community, developing genuinely rare expertise, becoming known as someone whose judgment about a particular domain is trusted, until eventually, without any single dramatic event marking the transition, others simply begin coming through you as a natural, efficient step toward what they're trying to reach. There is an important ethical dimension to this code that deserves direct attention, because access-based power, poorly used, easily curdles into gatekeeping that serves the gatekeeper at genuine cost to everyone else involved. Extracting excessive value simply for facilitating passage, or blocking worthy people arbitrarily to preserve a sense of scarcity around one's own position. This version of the code is fragile as well as ethically troubling, because it invites resentment and active efforts to route around the obstruction it creates. And these efforts eventually succeed often enough that gatekeeping built this way rarely survives long-term. The more durable version of this code combines genuine access with genuine facilitation, using your position not merely to extract value from those seeking to pass through, but to actually help worthy people and ideas reach what they're trying to reach, more efficiently than they could have managed alone. This generosity, rather than undermining the value of your position, tends to reinforce it, because it builds a reputation for being genuinely useful to engage with, which draws even more legitimate traffic through the very point of access you occupy. Controlling what people want to reach is, in the end, less about erecting barriers and more about becoming a trusted, efficient conduit. A position built slowly through real expertise, real relationships, and real credibility, that ends up mattering considerably more than any single direct grant of formal authority ever could, precisely because it cannot be revoked by anyone else's decision. It was built by you, deliberately over time, and it remains yours for exactly as long as you continue to serve the function that made others want to reach you in the first place. Chapter 23: The Code of Strategy. Most decisions are made in response to whatever is directly in front of a person at the moment they're made. The immediate problem, the immediate opportunity, the immediate pressure demanding a response. This is understandable because immediate concerns are, by definition, the ones creating the most felt urgency. But a person who only ever thinks one move ahead, however skillfully they handle each individual move, will consistently be outmaneuvered by anyone who has taken the time to consider not just the current decision, but the several decisions likely to follow from it, and the several decisions likely to follow from those. This capacity, thinking several moves beyond the present moment, rather than only within it, is one of the clearest, most learnable distinctions between tactical competence and genuine strategic thinking, and it deserves deliberate cultivation rather than being left to occur naturally, which it rarely does under pressure. The habit of thinking beyond the current move begins with a simple but frequently skipped question. If this decision succeeds exactly as intended, what situation does that success actually create? And is that resulting situation genuinely one you want to be in? This question matters because many decisions that look correct when evaluated only against their immediate goal turn out, on closer inspection, to create downstream complications that outweigh the initial benefit. A negotiating tactic that wins a favorable term today may permanently damage a relationship whose long-term value exceeds what was gained. A public correction that wins an argument in the moment may create a lasting adversary whose cooperation you will need later, in circumstances you cannot yet foresee. Evaluating a decision only against its immediate objective, without tracing its likely second and third-order consequences, produces a pattern of short-term wins that frequently compound into long-term strategic weakness. This forward-looking discipline also requires imagining how others are likely to respond to your move, not simply assuming your intended outcome will unfold exactly as planned. Every significant action taken in a competitive or social environment invites a reaction, and that reaction shapes the situation as much as your original move did. A skilled strategist asks, before acting, what the most likely responses to this particular move actually are, not only from the primary party involved, but from anyone else who might be affected or who might be watching and drawing conclusions about how to treat you in the future. Planning several moves ahead means having a rough sense of how you would respond to each of these likely reactions, so that you are not caught improvising a response to a foreseeable development that careful thought could have anticipated well in advance. There is a particular value in this practice that goes beyond simply avoiding downstream mistakes. It also reveals opportunities that purely reactive thinking misses entirely. A move that appears unremarkable when evaluated only for its immediate effect may open a strategic possibility 3 or 4 steps later that would never have existed otherwise. A relationship it makes possible, a position it establishes, a piece of information it eventually surfaces. Strategic thinkers often make moves that look, in isolation, mildly inefficient or even unnecessary, because the value of that particular move is not fully realized until several steps later. Once the groundwork it quietly laid becomes relevant to something that wasn't yet visible at the time the move was made. This kind of thinking requires holding multiple possible futures in mind simultaneously, rather than committing early to a single expected outcome and planning only for that one path. Because other people's decisions cannot be fully predicted or controlled, useful strategic planning resembles less a fixed sequence of moves and more a flexible map of likely branches. If this happens, this response follows. If that happens instead, a different response becomes appropriate. Building this kind of branching awareness, even informally, before entering a significant negotiation, conversation, or decision, produces a calmness and adaptability under pressure that purely reactive approaches rarely match. Because surprises that would otherwise derail an unprepared person have often already been considered, at least in rough form, well before they actually occur. None of this requires elaborate, formal planning documents or an unrealistic degree of certainty about how the future will unfold. Genuine strategy accepts uncertainty as a permanent condition rather than something to be eliminated through more analysis. What it requires is a consistent habit applied before significant decisions of pausing to ask what happens next, and then next again, rather than stopping the analysis at the boundary of the current, most visible move. This single habit practiced patiently over time produces a form of foresight that appears, to those who have not cultivated it, almost like a kind of intuition, when in fact it is simply the visible result of a discipline anyone can learn. Taking the time, consistently, to see further down the board than the present move alone would ever reveal. Part 5. Navigating People. Chapter 24. The Code of Ego. There is a particular trap that catches capable people more often than incapable ones, precisely because capable people are usually right more often than they're wrong. And being consistently right creates a habit of insisting on it, even in situations where being right matters far less than being effective. This trap is the compulsion to win every disagreement, correct every minor error, claim every point of credit that is technically owed. Each individual instance of this compulsion can be justified. The correction was accurate. The credit was genuinely earned. The point was worth making. But a pattern of insisting on every small victory, however individually justified, produces a cumulative cost that frequently outweighs whatever was gained in each isolated instance. People begin to experience your presence as a constant, low-grade contest rather than a collaboration. And they adjust their behavior around you accordingly, becoming more guarded, less generous, and considerably less willing to extend you the benefit of the doubt when it actually matters. The discipline being described here is not an argument for false modesty or for suppressing genuine disagreement on matters that actually warrant it. It is a much narrower and more strategic principle, distinguishing between battles that genuinely matter and battles that exist purely to satisfy ego, and consciously conceding the second category, even when you could technically win it, because the cost of winning consistently exceeds the value of the win itself. Being visibly, repeatedly right about small, low-stakes matters rarely builds the kind of goodwill and trust that influence actually depends on. It far more often builds quiet resentment, because most people do not enjoy being corrected or outmatched, even graciously on a regular basis, regardless of how accurate the correction happens to be. Letting others win small battles serves a purpose beyond simple diplomatic pleasantness. It functions as a form of social currency, deposited steadily over time, that becomes available for withdrawal when a genuinely important disagreement eventually arises. A person who has conceded minor points generously and consistently earns, through that consistent generosity, considerably more latitude when they eventually do hold firm on something that actually matters. Their firmness, in that moment, reads as significant precisely because it stands out against a pattern of general flexibility, rather than blending into a constant, exhausting pattern of contest over everything, large and small alike. Someone who fights every battle equally hard, regardless of stakes, makes it far harder for anyone to distinguish which disagreements genuinely matter to them. And this erodes the impact of their objections even when those objections are entirely justified. There is also a practical benefit worth naming clearly. Conceding small battles preserves relational capital for the moments that genuinely require it. And it allows you to reserve your full attention, energy, and credibility for disputes that actually affect outcomes you care about. Treating every minor disagreement as equally worth fighting exhausts a finite resource. The goodwill and patience others extend to you on matters that, viewed honestly a month later, rarely turn out to have mattered nearly as much as they seem to in the moment. Strategic restraint here is not weakness. It is a form of resource management applied to a resource, relational trust and goodwill, that is just as real and just as limited as time or money, even though it rarely gets discussed in those explicit terms. This code requires developing real discernment about which battles belong in which category, because the distinction is not always obvious in the moment, particularly when ego is activated and every disagreement briefly feels important. A useful test involves asking, honestly, whether the outcome of this particular disagreement will meaningfully affect anything a month from now, or whether its significance is almost entirely confined to the immediate, momentary satisfaction of being proven right. Most disagreements, evaluated honestly against this test, turn out to belong to the second category far more often than pride would prefer to admit. And recognizing this pattern consistently is what allows the discipline of strategic concession to actually be practiced, rather than merely admired in theory, while ego continues to insist on winning everything in practice. Letting others win the small battles is not a strategy of constant self-erasure, and it does not mean abandoning genuine principles or important disagreements simply to preserve short-term comfort. It means developing the judgment to know the difference between what truly matters and what only feels, in a passing moment of wounded pride, as though it does, and choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to spend your influence on the former rather than depleting it on the latter. Chapter 25. The Code of Persuasion. There is a common but mistaken belief that persuasion is primarily a matter of superior argument, that if the logic is sound enough, the evidence compelling enough, and the delivery clear enough, minds will change accordingly. Anyone who has tried to argue someone out of a firmly held position using only facts and logic has likely discovered how poorly this actually works in practice. People rarely change their minds because they have been out-argued. More often, being out-argued produces defensiveness, a doubling down on the original position, and a search for reasons to dismiss the argument rather than genuine reconsideration of it. Real persuasion operates through a different mechanism entirely, one that has less to do with defeating a position and more to do with creating the conditions under which a person can arrive at a new conclusion and experience it as their own. This distinction matters because forced agreement, extracted through pressure or superior argument, tends to be shallow and temporary. A person argued into a position they haven't genuinely internalized will often quietly abandon it the moment the pressure lifts, or will comply only in the narrowest technical sense, while privately remaining unconvinced and, in many cases, newly resentful of having been maneuvered. A person who arrives at the same conclusion through their own reasoning, guided rather than pushed, tends to hold that position far more durably, because they experience it as something they discovered rather than something imposed on them. This is why the most effective persuaders spend less time perfecting their own argument and more time understanding how to help someone else's thinking move naturally toward a conclusion that argument alone could not have forced. One of the most reliable tools for this kind of movement is the well-placed question, rather than the well-constructed statement. A statement invites evaluation and, frequently, resistance, because it asks the listener to accept or reject something coming from outside themselves. A genuine question, asked with real curiosity rather than as a rhetorical trap, invites the listener into their own reasoning process, and people are considerably more receptive to conclusions they reach through their own thinking than to conclusions handed to them, however elegantly, by someone else. Asking someone what they think might happen if a current approach continues unchanged, rather than telling them directly that the approach is flawed, often produces more genuine reconsideration than the most carefully constructed counterargument, because the listener is doing the actual work of reasoning rather than simply defending against an external claim. Persuasion also depends heavily on addressing the emotional terrain surrounding a position, not only its logical structure, because most positions people hold are anchored as much in identity, fear, or social belonging as they are in pure reasoning. A position tied to someone's sense of self or to their standing within a group they belong to will not move through logic alone, no matter how sound that logic is, because changing the position feels, to the person holding it, like changing something about who they are or where they belong. Effective persuasion in these cases requires first addressing this underlying terrain, offering the person a way to update their view without it costing them their identity or their standing. Making clear that reconsidering a position is compatible with remaining the same fundamentally reasonable, respected person they were before the conversation began. There is also real value in offering a person a graceful path toward changing their mind, rather than forcing them to choose between total capitulation and total resistance. Presenting new information as an addition to what they already know, rather than a direct contradiction of it, allows a shift in position to feel like refinement rather than defeat. Acknowledging genuine merit in their original view before introducing a different consideration signals that you are not trying to dismantle their thinking entirely, only to add something worth weighing alongside it. And this signal alone often lowers the defensiveness that would otherwise block any further movement. Moving minds without forcing them requires patience that direct argument does not, and it requires a genuine willingness to let the other person arrive at their own pace, sometimes across multiple conversations rather than a single decisive exchange. But persuasion built this way tends to produce agreement that actually holds, rather than compliance that quietly reverses the moment pressure eases. And it preserves something argument alone frequently destroys: the relationship itself, which remains intact and often strengthened precisely because the other person was never made to feel defeated in the process of being genuinely moved. Chapter 26. The Code of Boundaries. There is a specific mistake that undermines a great deal of otherwise sound relational effort: the assumption that respect can be secured by asking for it directly, through explanation, appeal, or even confrontation, when someone has crossed a line. Requesting respect after the fact, however clearly and reasonably articulated, rarely produces the lasting change it aims for. Because respect does not function primarily as a response to a stated request. It functions as a response to demonstrated consequence. What actually happens, reliably, when a boundary is crossed. A person can explain their limits with perfect clarity and still find them repeatedly disregarded if nothing consistent ever follows from that disregard. Because people calibrate their behavior toward others based largely on what they have observed to be tolerated, not on what they have been told, in words, is preferred. This distinction reframes boundaries as something built through pattern rather than declared through statement. A boundary exists, in any meaningful sense, only at the point where a consequence reliably follows its violation. Prior to that point, a stated limit is closer to a preference, worth communicating, but not yet functioning as an actual boundary in the eyes of anyone testing it, consciously or not. This is uncomfortable to accept, because it places the responsibility for a boundary's effectiveness less on the clarity of its statement, and more on the consistency of what follows when it is crossed, which requires a kind of follow-through that many people find more difficult than the initial act of stating the boundary itself. The follow-through required here does not need to be dramatic or punitive to be effective. Often, the most durable boundaries are enforced through quiet, consistent, proportionate response rather than through visible confrontation. A person who consistently arrives late to agreed meetings might simply find that meetings begin reliably without them, rather than being lectured about punctuality each time. A colleague who routinely takes credit for shared work might simply find that future collaboration becomes noticeably more limited and more carefully documented, without any dramatic confrontation ever taking place. These responses communicate the boundary far more effectively than any explanation could, because they demonstrate, through direct experience, that the behavior in question carries a real cost, and demonstrated cost changes behavior far more reliably than explained preference ever does. There is a particular vulnerability worth naming honestly. Enforcing a boundary consistently often produces short-term discomfort, friction, or even open conflict, and many people abandon the boundary at exactly this point, precisely when consistency matters most. A boundary enforced once and then abandoned under pressure teaches a lesson opposite to the one intended. It signals that resistance, complaint, or simply waiting out the discomfort will eventually cause the boundary to dissolve, which makes future violations more likely rather than less. Because the other person has now learned, through direct experience, that the boundary is negotiable under sufficient pressure. This is why boundaries tested early in a relationship and held firmly despite initial discomfort tend to produce far more durable respect over the long run than boundaries introduced later, after a long pattern of accommodation has already taught the other person that none genuinely exist. It is worth distinguishing boundaries built this way from rigidity or punitive control, because the two are easily confused, and the confusion undermines the entire practice. A boundary is not an attempt to control another person's behavior directly, which rarely succeeds and often provokes exactly the resistance it hopes to avoid. It is a clear, consistent statement, communicated through consequence rather than argument, about what you will and will not continue to accept, tolerate, or participate in. What the other person does in response remains entirely their choice. What changes through consistent boundary enforcement is simply what continues to be available to them if they choose to disregard it. And this distinction, subtle as it sounds, is what separates a genuine boundary from an attempt at control that most people, correctly, resist. Respect built this way tends to be more durable than respect requested directly, because it rests on demonstrated reality rather than stated preference. And demonstrated reality is far harder to dismiss, forget, or quietly test again later. The work required is less about finding the right words to explain a limit, and more about the harder, quieter discipline of actually following through consistently on what those words describe. A discipline that, practiced patiently over time, builds a form of respect that no amount of persuasive explanation could have produced on its own. Chapter 27. The Code of Trust. Beneath every negotiation, every partnership, every extended exchange of value between people, operates a currency more fundamental than any of the terms explicitly being discussed. Trust. It is rarely named directly in the moment, and it appears nowhere on a contract. Yet it determines, more than almost any other single factor, how efficiently an agreement can be reached, how much verification and protection each side feels compelled to build into the terms, and how the relationship behaves once circumstances shift and the agreement is inevitably tested by something neither party anticipated. Where trust is genuinely present, exchanges move quickly, terms remain relatively simple, and both sides extend a reasonable benefit of the doubt when ambiguity arises. Where trust is absent, every exchange becomes slower, more heavily fortified with contingencies, and more fragile under any pressure at all, regardless of how carefully the explicit terms were drafted. This currency accumulates and depletes according to a logic worth understanding precisely, because it does not behave the way people often assume. Trust is built far more slowly than it is destroyed, and it is built primarily through small, consistent moments, rather than through occasional grand gestures. A person who follows through reliably on minor commitments, arriving when promised, delivering what was agreed to, communicating proactively when circumstances change rather than waiting to be asked, builds trust steadily, almost invisibly, through the accumulation of these unremarkable moments. A single significant act of generosity or loyalty can accelerate this accumulation meaningfully. But it rarely substitutes entirely for the steady pattern because people learn, correctly, to weight demonstrated consistency more heavily than isolated impressive gestures, which can be performed strategically in ways that ongoing daily behavior is much harder to fake convincingly over time. The asymmetry between building and destroying trust deserves particular attention, because it explains why a single serious breach can undo years of careful accumulation almost instantly. This is not, on reflection, an unreasonable calibration on the part of the person extending trust. If years of reliable behavior can be abandoned the moment it becomes inconvenient to maintain, then the entire pattern was, in some sense, conditional all along. And the discovery of that conditionality reasonably causes the other party to reassess the relationship far more broadly than the specific incident alone would seem to warrant. This is why maintaining trust requires more than simply avoiding large, dramatic betrayals. It requires genuine consistency, particularly in moments when maintaining the consistency is costly, inconvenient, or unlikely to ever be discovered if abandoned, because it is precisely in these unwitnessed moments that the most durable trust is actually built. There is a strategic dimension to trust that extends beyond its role in individual relationships. It functions as a significant efficiency multiplier across an entire network of dealings over time. High-trust relationships require less verification, fewer protective contingencies, faster decision-making, and more willingness on both sides to extend flexibility when unexpected circumstances arise. This efficiency compounds considerably over a career or a lifetime of dealings. Because a person known reliably for trustworthy behavior is offered opportunities, introductions, and favorable terms that a person with an uncertain or damaged reputation for trust simply never sees, regardless of their actual competence in other respects. Trust, in this sense, is not merely a pleasant relational quality. It is one of the most consequential practical assets a person can accumulate over time, quietly shaping which doors open easily and which remain closed, no matter how capable the person on the other side happens to be. Rebuilding trust after it has been damaged, whether through a genuine mistake or a deliberate breach, requires a different and considerably more demanding process than building it originally. It requires consistent, verifiable behavior sustained over a meaningfully longer period than would have been required to establish the same level of trust from a neutral starting point. Because the damaged party is now, reasonably, weighing new behavior against the specific evidence of unreliability they've already witnessed. Genuine accountability, acknowledging the breach directly, without minimizing or deflecting it, followed by sustained, demonstrated change rather than simply a verbal commitment to change, is the only path that reliably rebuilds trust over time. And even this path requires patience considerably beyond what most people expect when they first attempt it. Trust, understood as the actual currency behind every significant deal, deserves the same deliberate management most people reserve for more visible forms of value, money, reputation, formal credentials. It is accumulated slowly, through unglamorous consistency maintained even when no one is watching. And it determines, more than any single negotiated term, how smoothly, how durably, and how favorably every future exchange with a given person or network is likely to unfold. Chapter 28. The Code of Conflict. Conflict, unlike many of the subtler dynamics discussed throughout this book, announces itself plainly. A disagreement surfaces, positions harden, and a decision must be made about whether to engage fully, engage partially, or decline to engage at all. What separates people who navigate conflict effectively from those who are repeatedly worn down by it is rarely superior argumentation in the moment. It is the quality of judgment applied before the conflict fully unfolds. In the decision about which conflicts genuinely warrant engagement and which are better handled through de-escalation, delay, or deliberate non-engagement. Treating every available conflict as one that must be fought is a strategic error nearly as costly as avoiding every conflict out of discomfort. And both errors stem from the same underlying failure: reacting to conflict as it arises rather than evaluating it deliberately against what actually matters. The first discipline required here is separating the emotional charge of a conflict from its actual strategic significance, because these two dimensions are frequently mismatched in ways that mislead reactive judgment. A minor slight, delivered publicly, often generates disproportionate emotional intensity precisely because it is witnessed by others. And this intensity can create a strong pull toward immediate, forceful response, even when the underlying stakes are genuinely small and likely to be forgotten within days. Conversely, a quiet, private erosion of trust or position, something no one else observes and that produces no immediate emotional spike, may carry far greater long-term significance than its low emotional temperature would suggest. Strategic engagement with conflict requires evaluating actual consequence, not merely emotional volume, before deciding how much of yourself to commit to a given dispute. A useful filter, applied consistently, involves asking what is genuinely at risk if this particular conflict is left unaddressed, and weighing that honestly against what would actually be required to address it well. Some conflicts, left alone, resolve themselves naturally as circumstances shift, or simply fade in significance as time passes and other priorities take precedence for everyone involved. Engaging with these conflicts anyway, out of pride or a reflexive need to respond to every provocation, spends resources, time, attention, relational goodwill on disputes that would have cost nothing to simply let pass. Other conflicts, left unaddressed, compound quietly over time into much larger problems. A boundary violation ignored once becomes a pattern. A false narrative left uncorrected becomes an accepted account of events. Distinguishing between these two categories, before conflict escalates on its own emotional momentum, is the central skill this code depends on. There is also real value in choosing not just whether to engage, but how much of yourself to commit once engagement has been chosen. Not every worthwhile conflict requires total, maximal effort. Many can be addressed effectively through a measured, proportionate response that resolves the actual issue without escalating the broader relationship into open hostility. Reserving full, forceful engagement for conflicts that genuinely threaten something significant, a core boundary, a foundational trust, a matter of real consequence, while handling smaller disputes with lighter, more measured responses, preserves both relational capital and personal energy for the moments that truly require their full deployment. A strategist who fights every battle at maximum intensity trains their environment to expect that intensity constantly, which paradoxically diminishes its impact in the rare cases where it is genuinely warranted. Timing plays a significant role in this code as well, echoing the earlier discussion of patience. Many conflicts benefit from a deliberate pause before response, not to avoid addressing them, but to ensure the response chosen reflects considered strategy rather than the immediate emotional reaction the provocation was designed, consciously or not, to produce. A conflict addressed a day later, once the initial emotional charge has settled, is very often handled more effectively than the same conflict addressed in its first heated moment, because the response can be calibrated to actual stakes rather than to the temporary intensity of the initial reaction. Choosing battles like a strategist ultimately requires a kind of emotional discipline that runs counter to instinct, because instinct treats every conflict as urgent and every provocation as deserving of response. Strategic judgment asks a different, quieter question before engaging. Does this particular battle actually serve what matters most to me over the long term? Or does it merely satisfy an immediate emotional pull that will look, in retrospect, considerably less significant than it currently feels? Learning to answer this question honestly, and to act on that answer even when instinct pulls in a different direction, is what separates a person repeatedly depleted by conflict from one who moves through it with genuine strategic control. Chapter 29. The Code of Loyalty. There is a difference, often discovered only under real pressure, between people who are with you when circumstances are favorable and people who are with you regardless of circumstance. And this difference is one of the most consequential distinctions anyone building lasting influence needs to learn to recognize accurately. Favorable circumstance loyalty is common, comfortable, and largely unreliable as a predictor of behavior once conditions shift. Because it was never genuinely tested in the first place, it costs nothing to remain aligned with someone whose success currently benefits you. And this alignment reveals very little about what that same person will do once your position weakens, once supporting you becomes costly, or once a more advantageous alliance presents itself elsewhere. Mistaking this convenient, untested alignment for genuine loyalty is one of the more costly errors people make in building their inner circle, because the mistake typically only becomes visible at the exact moment genuine loyalty would have mattered most. Discovering who is actually with you requires attention to a particular kind of evidence, gathered patiently over time rather than assumed from pleasant conversation or stated allegiance. Genuine loyalty reveals itself most clearly in moments of cost. When supporting you requires someone to spend their own credibility, decline a more advantageous opportunity elsewhere, or absorb some discomfort on your behalf with no immediate benefit to themselves. These moments are relatively rare, which is precisely why they carry so much diagnostic value. A person's behavior in the many low-cost, easy circumstances that make up most of ordinary life tells you comparatively little, while their behavior in the few genuinely costly moments tells you almost everything you need to know about where their actual loyalty lies. This code requires a particular kind of honest observation, because the natural human tendency is to interpret ambiguous behavior generously, especially from people we have already decided to trust or people whose company we genuinely enjoy. Someone who consistently offers enthusiastic support in public while quietly hedging, deflecting, or distancing themselves the moment real risk enters the picture is providing clear evidence about the actual limits of their loyalty, even if that evidence is more comfortable to overlook than to register fully. Paying close, honest attention to this pattern, not with cynicism toward everyone, but with genuine discernment applied consistently over time, protects against the particular vulnerability of discovering, at the worst possible moment, that support you had counted on was never as solid as it appeared to be. There is also a distinction worth drawing between loyalty to a person and loyalty to a person's position or usefulness, because these are frequently confused, and the confusion matters considerably. Some alliances are built primarily around what a person currently offers: access, resources, proximity to power. and this kind of alliance tends to dissolve quickly and without much sentiment once the underlying resource diminishes or disappears. Other alliances are built around the actual person, independent of their current position, and these tend to persist through exactly the kind of reversal that dissolves the first kind. Recognizing which type of loyalty you are actually receiving before you need to rely on it requires honest reflection about what, specifically, draws a given person toward you: genuine regard and shared history, or simply the current usefulness of your position, which may or may not survive a significant change in circumstance. This code also asks something of you in return, because loyalty observed and evaluated in others invites the same standard applied to your own behavior. Being the kind of person whose support does not evaporate the moment it becomes costly is, itself, one of the most valuable forms of influence available, because it is rare enough to be genuinely noticed and remembered by the people who experience it directly. This is not an argument for unconditional loyalty extended regardless of a relationship's actual merit. Loyalty to people or causes that no longer deserve it becomes its own form of poor judgment. It is an argument for extending genuine, tested loyalty deliberately to the smaller number of people who have earned it, and for honoring that loyalty consistently, particularly in the moments when honoring it is inconvenient, because those are precisely the moments in which loyalty either proves itself real or reveals itself to have been circumstantial all along. Knowing who is actually with you, and being someone others can accurately know the same about, requires patient observation over comfortable assumption and honest self-examination over convenient self-image. It is, in the end, one of the most practically consequential forms of clarity available to anyone building lasting influence, because the moment this knowledge matters most is rarely a moment that offers any warning before it arrives. Part 6. The Long Game. Chapter 30. The Code of Adaptation. There is a particular kind of failure that overtakes people, not because they lacked skill or preparation, but because they held rigidly to an approach that had once worked well, long after circumstances had shifted enough to make that approach obsolete. Rigidity disguised as principle is one of the more common and more avoidable causes of decline among people who were, at one point, genuinely effective. The strategies, postures, and habits that built early success were built for a particular set of conditions, and conditions rarely remain static for long. A person unwilling to notice this shift and unwilling to adjust accordingly eventually finds themselves applying yesterday's solution to today's problem, with diminishing results that they often attribute, mistakenly, to bad luck or a temporarily unfavorable environment, rather than to their own failure to adapt. Adaptation, properly understood, is not the same as having no firm principles or shifting positions opportunistically with every passing pressure. That version of flexibility produces its own serious problem, an unreliability that erodes trust just as surely as rigidity erodes effectiveness. The distinction that matters here is between core values, which should remain genuinely stable, and tactical approaches, which should remain genuinely flexible, adjusted continuously in response to what current conditions actually require, rather than what worked in different conditions previously. Confusing these two categories in either direction causes real damage, Mistaking a tactic for a core value produces the rigidity described above, while mistaking a core value for a mere tactic produces the kind of unprincipled drift that destroys trust and reputation over time. Recognizing when adaptation is genuinely required demands the same quality of ongoing observation described early in this book, applied now not to individual people, but to broader shifting conditions. A market changing, an organizational culture evolving, a relationship entering a new phase with different needs than the phase before it. The signals that adaptation is overdue are often visible well before they become undeniable. Results that once came easily now require disproportionate effort to achieve. A pattern once effective is met increasingly with resistance rather than the receptiveness it used to generate. A style that once read as confident begins to read, in a changed environment, as out of step. These signals are frequently dismissed or rationalized by the person experiencing them, because acknowledging them requires admitting that something which once worked no longer does, which can feel like an admission of personal failure rather than what it actually is. Simply accurate information about a changed environment. There is a particular discipline involved in adapting without abandoning genuine identity in the process. And this discipline separates skillful adaptation from a kind of anxious shape-shifting that ultimately undermines trust. Skillful adaptation changes methods while preserving underlying purpose. The same core commitment to a particular outcome or value pursued through a different, more currently effective approach, rather than the purpose itself being discarded the moment it becomes inconvenient. A leader who once commanded primarily through direct authority might need to adapt toward more collaborative methods as an organization's culture shifts, without abandoning their underlying commitment to clear standards and accountability. The visible behavior changes considerably. The underlying commitment, if adaptation is done well, remains genuinely intact throughout. This code also requires a particular kind of humility about one's own past success, because success itself often becomes the primary obstacle to necessary adaptation. A person whose approach worked exceptionally well for a significant period develops, understandably, real confidence in that approach. And this confidence can calcify into an unwillingness to question it, even once clear evidence suggests the approach's effectiveness has genuinely declined. The very success that built this confidence becomes, paradoxically, the thing preventing the adaptation that continued success now requires. Guarding against this requires deliberately treating even well-established, historically successful approaches as provisional rather than permanent, subject to ongoing reassessment against current results rather than protected indefinitely by their past record. Bending before you break is, in the end, less about any specific tactical adjustment and more about maintaining a particular relationship to your own methods, holding them with genuine conviction while actually using them, but holding them loosely enough that genuine evidence of their declining effectiveness can actually be seen and acted upon, rather than defended against out of attachment to what once worked well. This flexibility, maintained around a stable core of genuine values and purpose, produces a durability that rigid consistency, however impressive in its early stages, simply cannot match once circumstances inevitably shift in ways no single approach could have anticipated indefinitely. Chapter 31. The Code of Legacy. Most of the influence described throughout this book is built to serve immediate and near-term purposes. A negotiation won, a reputation established, a relationship deepened, a position secured. These are worthwhile and necessary pursuits, but they share a common limitation. Their value, however real, tends to be bounded by your own continued presence and continued effort. This final part of the book turns toward a different, longer horizon. The question of what, if anything, continues to matter and continue functioning after your direct involvement has ended, whether through moving on to something new or, eventually, through the simple passage of time that outlasts any individual career or life. Legacy, understood this way, is not vanity about being remembered. It is the more practical question of what you are actually building, and whether that thing is designed to depend permanently on you, or capable of continuing to generate value once you are no longer the one directly maintaining it. The distinction that matters most here is between influence that is personally held and influence that is institutionally or relationally embedded. Structures, systems, relationships, and reputations that continue functioning independent of your ongoing direct involvement. A leader who builds an organization entirely around their own personal decision-making, personal relationships, and personal judgment creates something genuinely powerful while they remain present, but something that frequently struggles or collapses once they leave, because nothing was built to function without them at the center. A leader who deliberately builds systems, develops other people's capability, and distributes knowledge and relationships beyond themselves creates something less immediately impressive in the moment, perhaps, but considerably more durable. An organization capable of continuing to function and even thrive well after their own direct involvement has ended. This code requires a genuine shift in how success is measured, away from metrics centered entirely on personal, immediate outcomes, and toward metrics that account for what continues after you step back. Are the people you have led capable of operating effectively without your constant direct involvement? Or does everything meaningful still route through you personally? Has the knowledge you've accumulated been genuinely transferred to others? Or does it remain locked inside your own head, creating exactly the kind of personal indispensability discussed earlier in this book, which feels secure in the short term, but ultimately limits what you've built to the span of your own direct participation? These questions are uncomfortable for people who have built genuine value around their own personal centrality, because answering them honestly often reveals how much of what looks like an organization or a system is, in practice, simply an extension of one person's ongoing individual effort. There is a particular generosity required to build genuine legacy, because it frequently means investing effort into developing other people's capability, even when that development eventually makes those people less dependent on you specifically. A trade that can feel, in the short term, like giving away exactly the kind of necessity and leverage discussed earlier in this book. This apparent tension resolves once the longer timeline is properly considered. The influence gained through indispensability is real, but bounded, lasting only as long as your direct involvement continues, while the influence gained through genuinely developing others, building durable systems, and distributing capability beyond yourself compounds over a much longer arc, often long after any individual instance of that generosity has been forgotten by the specific people who benefited from it. Legacy also depends heavily on the quality and durability of relationships built along the way, not merely the systems and structures created through direct effort. People who were genuinely developed, genuinely respected, and genuinely supported throughout your active involvement tend to carry that experience forward into their own subsequent influence, extending what you built through their own continued work long after any formal connection to you has ended. This is among the most durable forms of legacy available because it does not depend on any particular structure surviving intact. It depends only on the people you influenced, carrying something forward in their own way, informed by what they experienced through their association with you. Building what outlasts you requires a genuine willingness to prioritize long-term durability over short-term personal centrality, which runs counter to many of the more immediate incentives that reward visible, personal indispensability in the present moment. But influence measured only across your own active involvement, however impressive while it lasts, remains fundamentally bounded by your own continued presence. Influence built deliberately to outlast that presence through developed people, distributed knowledge, and durable systems represents a genuinely different order of achievement, one that continues generating value long after the specific effort required to build it has been forgotten by nearly everyone except the people who quietly continue benefiting from it. Chapter 32. The Code of Renewal. There is a common assumption, rarely examined directly, that influence, once genuinely built, simply persists on its own. That reputation, capability, and relationships, once established, continue functioning at their original strength indefinitely, requiring no further deliberate maintenance. This assumption is mistaken, and the mistake tends to produce a particular kind of slow, often unnoticed decline. A person who built genuine influence at one point in their career gradually finds that same influence eroding, not through any single dramatic failure, but through the simple accumulation of neglect, skills that were never updated, relationships that were never actively maintained, knowledge that quietly became outdated while its holder assumed it remained as current and valuable as when it was first acquired. The mechanism behind this decay is worth understanding clearly, because it rarely announces itself the way an active failure would. Skills atrophy gradually when they are not actively practiced and updated, particularly in domains where the underlying conditions continue to evolve. What constituted genuine expertise a decade ago may now be, at best, a reasonable foundation requiring significant updating rather than current, cutting-edge capability. Relationships, similarly, do not persist automatically simply because they were once genuinely close. Without periodic renewed contact, effort, and mutual investment, even strong relationships gradually thin into something closer to a vague, pleasant memory of past closeness, rather than an active, currently functioning source of support and connection. Reputation, too, requires ongoing reinforcement through continued visible behavior. A reputation built years ago on genuine accomplishment can fade from active relevance if it is not continually refreshed through more recent evidence that the underlying qualities remain genuinely present. This code asks for a particular kind of ongoing discipline that runs counter to a natural human tendency, to treat past achievement as a stable, permanent foundation, rather than something requiring continued active investment. The temptation, understandably, is to rest on what has already been built, to coast on an established reputation, to rely on relationships formed years earlier without renewing the investment that originally created them, to continue applying the same expertise without updating it against a changed environment. This temptation is especially strong precisely because the early stages of decline are so difficult to notice from the inside. A person coasting on past investment typically continues to feel, subjectively, much the same as they did when that investment was actively current, even as its actual effectiveness quietly diminishes in ways only fully visible in retrospect, once the gap has become significant enough to produce clearly diminished results. Renewal, practiced deliberately, requires treating influence not as a fixed achievement, but as an ongoing practice requiring continued, active maintenance across each of its major components. This means periodically reassessing whether your actual skills and knowledge remain genuinely current against the environment you're operating in, rather than assuming past learning remains sufficient indefinitely. It means deliberately reaching out to renew relationships that have gone quiet, rather than assuming they remain as strong as they once were, simply because no explicit rupture has occurred. It means continuing to produce visible evidence of the qualities your reputation depends on, rather than assuming that reputation, once established, requires no further reinforcement to remain accurate and current in other people's minds. There is a particular value in building renewal into regular practice, rather than waiting until decline becomes obvious enough to demand urgent correction. Because renewal undertaken proactively is considerably easier and less costly than renewal undertaken reactively. After significant erosion has already occurred and needs to be actively reversed rather than simply maintained. A relationship checked in on periodically before any strain has developed requires only light, ongoing effort to remain strong. The same relationship, left entirely unattended for years and then suddenly needed, requires a much larger, more deliberate effort to rebuild, if it can be rebuilt at all in its original form. The same logic applies to skills, knowledge, and reputation. Periodic, modest renewal maintains value efficiently, while allowing significant decay to accumulate before addressing it, demands a far larger, more difficult recovery effort later. Power that isn't refreshed decays not because influence is inherently unstable, but because it was never actually a fixed achievement in the first place. It was always a living, ongoing pattern of demonstrated capability, active relationship, and current relevance, requiring the same kind of continued attention that originally built it. Recognizing this, and building genuine habits of periodic renewal into how you maintain your capabilities, your relationships, and your reputation, protects against the quiet, often unnoticed decline that overtakes even genuinely capable people who mistake past achievement for a permanent, self-sustaining foundation, rather than what it actually is. Something that must be continually, deliberately renewed to remain as strong as it once was. Chapter 33. The Code of Mastery. There is a particular stage, reached only after long and genuine practice, at which the codes described throughout this book stop functioning as separate techniques to be consciously selected and deployed. and begin functioning instead as something closer to a single, integrated way of being present in the world. In the earlier stages of learning influence, each code requires deliberate, effortful application. A conscious decision to observe before reacting, to hold silence rather than fill it, to choose ground carefully before engaging. This effortful application is necessary and unavoidable at first, but it is not the final destination. The final stage, reached slowly and only through sustained practice, is one in which these disciplines have become so thoroughly internalized that they no longer require conscious selection at all. They simply are how a person moves through their interactions without deliberation. In the same way an experienced musician no longer consciously thinks through individual finger placements, but simply plays. This distinction matters because it explains why genuine mastery looks, from the outside, almost effortless, even though it was built through years of exactly the kind of effortful, deliberate practice described throughout this book. A person who has genuinely internalized these codes does not appear to be strategizing in real time, because they are not. The strategic judgment has become woven into their instinctive response, available instantly rather than accessed through conscious deliberation. This is precisely what people are sensing when they describe someone as a natural at influence or leadership, when in fact what they are observing is the far end of a long process of practice that has simply become invisible through its own thoroughness. Reaching this stage requires a particular relationship to failure that most people find difficult to sustain over the necessary timeline. Early practice of any of these codes will frequently misfire. Silence held too long reads as coldness rather than restraint. A boundary enforced too rigidly damages a relationship that patience would have served better. A frame offered too early proves inaccurate once more information emerges. These failures are not evidence that the underlying codes are flawed. They are the necessary, unavoidable feedback through which genuine calibration is built. A person unwilling to tolerate this early period of imperfect, sometimes clumsy application will never reach the later stage where the same principles operate with genuine, integrated skill, because that later fluency is built entirely out of the accumulated lessons of earlier, imperfect attempts. There is also an ethical dimension to mastery that deserves direct attention as this book concludes. Because everything described across these 33 codes can be used toward genuinely different ends, and the underlying mechanics themselves remain neutral regarding which end they ultimately serve. A person can master observation, patience, positioning, and persuasion in service of manipulation and exploitation, extracting value from others while giving little of genuine worth in return. The same mastery can be applied in service of building genuine value for others alongside oneself, negotiating fairly rather than merely winning, building alliances based on real mutual benefit rather than one-sided extraction, using persuasion to move people toward conclusions that genuinely serve them rather than merely serving the persuader. The codes themselves do not determine which path is chosen. That choice remains entirely, unavoidably yours, made and remade in each individual interaction across an entire career and life. The deepest form of mastery, ultimately, is not measured by how skillfully these codes can be applied in isolation, but by whether they have been integrated into a life that also remains genuinely honest, generous, and worth respecting. Because influence built without this foundation, however technically skillful, tends to prove hollow and eventually unsustainable, while influence built alongside genuine integrity compounds into something considerably more durable and more worth having in the first place. What began in the preface of this book as an invitation to understand the real mechanics beneath power and influence closes here with a final, quieter invitation to build that understanding into a way of being that you would be genuinely proud to have others recognize in you, not merely a set of tactics deployed skillfully but privately regretted. That integration, skill fused permanently with genuine character, is the real mastery this book has been pointing toward all along. Final reflection. You now hold 33 codes that describe how influence actually moves between people, not the version taught in slogans, but the quieter mechanics beneath it. None of them work in isolation, and none of them work as a script to be recited. They work the way any real skill works, through patient, repeated practice, applied with judgment about which code a given moment actually calls for. It is worth remembering, as you close this book, that mastery without character is a hollow achievement. Everything described here can be used to extract, or it can be used to build for yourself and for the people around you at the same time. That choice was never something this book could make for you. It was only ever going to hand you the tools and trust you to decide what you build with them. Go build something worth having earned. Download this audiobook in high-quality MP3 format at MindShelf.net. For more timeless audiobooks on spiritual growth, psychology, self-improvement, and the art of living wisely, subscribe to MindShelf on YouTube and keep expanding your inner library of wisdom. Grow in awareness. Live in balance. This is MindShelf.